She was 22 and homeless. No lease, no spare key, no porch light waiting for her. Just a canvas satchel and $38.17 she had counted twice beneath the fluorescent hum of a bus station vending machine. And with that last dollar, she bought a condemned potash works outside Mill Creek, in Randolph County, West Virginia, a place the survey books said had fallen off local maps in 1896. The north wall leaned 3 inches out of plumb. Rain came through 2 seams in the roof. The county said the building had been closed since 1939 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the ash kettle's brick base, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 80 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Ruth Alma Bell had been learning how to wait her whole life without knowing it. She learned first in kitchens where the clock ticked louder than anyone speaking, in rented rooms with curtains too thin to keep out the headlights, and in the patient corners of houses that never belonged to her family for more than a year. Her childhood had not been cruel in any dramatic way. It was made of smaller departures, the kind nobody could point to afterward and call a wound. A mailbox painted blue in one town, then a rusted black one in another. A school desk with her name taped to it in September, then emptied by January. A mother folding clothes into a trash bag because cardboard boxes cost money, and a girl carrying the lightest bags because the adults said she was still growing. Ruth had been a narrow child, serious around the eyes, with hands that noticed things before her mind had language for them. She liked the smoothness of a spoon handle worn thin near the bowl. She liked door latches, chipped crockery, creak stones, kindling stacked by size. When other children wanted dolls with glossy hair or radios with bright buttons, Ruth wanted to know why flour sifted differently on damp days, why soot clung to one brick and not the next, why an iron pan could be brought back from ruin if a person was patient enough with grease and heat and time. Her mother, Ellen, used to say the girl had an old way about her. She did not always mean it kindly. Ellen Bell was a woman who had learned to survive by keeping nothing too dear. She wore her good blouse until the cuffs shone, kept receipts in envelopes, and could tell from the sound of a car on gravel whether it belonged to someone bringing trouble or someone needing a favor. She had once sung in church, Ruth was told, back when her voice was clear, and people looked up when she began the first verse, but Ruth knew her mother only after the singing had left her. Ellen's voice had settled into something lower, practical, with no room in it for surprise. Ruth's father was mostly a photograph kept between the pages of an old hymnal. His name had been Martin Bell, and he had worked timber for a while before a truck accident took him on a wet county road when Ruth was too young to gather a true memory of his face. What she remembered instead were the stories other people did not finish. Your daddy could plane a board smooth as milk. Your daddy never left a gate open. Your daddy had a laugh that came up from his boots. Those fragments became a kind of weather around him, not enough to hold, but enough to feel when the evening lowered and her mother stood at the sink too long. The one steady place in Ruth's life had been her grandfather's shed behind a white farmhouse near Franklin, where the land rose in worn folds and the air smelled of leaf mold, stove smoke, and creek water. Elias Bell was Martin's father, though Ruth never heard him speak of grief as if it was something worth displaying. He was a widower by then, broad in the shoulders and slow in the knees, with a beard the colour of ash and hands deeply marked by work. Every second Saturday, whenever Ellen could spare the gasoline, Ruth was left with him from morning until after supper. Those days had a rhythm so reliable that Ruth came to measure herself by them. Elias would meet her at the porch with a tin cup of weak coffee cut with milk, because he believed even children should learn the taste of bitterness in a gentle measure. Then he would take her to the shed, where every tool had a place, and every place had a reason. The shed was not large, but to Ruth it held a whole country. There were drawer knives hanging from pegs, iron hooks blackened near the tips, wooden paddles polished by decades of stirring, burlap sacks folded flat, a barrel of hardwood ash kept covered from damp, and an iron kettle so heavy that even empty it seemed to belong more to the earth than to any man. He had grown up around the last remnants of potash making in those mountains, and though the trade had already thinned into memory by the time he was a boy, his own grandmother had taught him what she knew. Hardwood was burned clean, ash was leached in careful layers, lye water was drawn off, boiled down, skimmed, watched and tested by touch and eye before it became something useful to soap makers, glassmen, dyers and farm wives, who knew exactly what could be made from what others swept away. Elias did not practice it for money. There was no money in it. He practiced because a thing forgotten too quickly becomes a kind of lie. On Saturdays, he taught Ruth how to sift ash without breathing it in, how to tell oak from hickory by the smell of the burn, how to set a kettle over coals so the heat rose even and did not scorch one side. He showed her how to dip a wooden paddle and read the coating by how it clung, how to keep a ledger with weather, wood, water, time, and result written plainly in pencil. He never hurried the lesson. If Ruth spilled, he handed her the broom. If she guessed, he told her to measure. If she asked the same question twice, he answered twice, though the second answer was often shorter. "Nothing honest is made in a hurry," he told her once, after she tried to force damp ash through a sieve with the heel of her hand. He had said it without sharpness. He lifted the sieve, tapped the rim, and let the grey powder settle of its own accord. At the time, Ruth thought he was speaking about ash, but the sentence stayed with her in rooms where the adults whispered, in school hallways where she stood new and unclaimed, and later in the long bad season when she had nothing left but the body she carried and the habits he had planted there. Elias had given her no speeches about endurance. He gave her slower work than she wanted and trusted the work to speak. When he died, the house was sold before the garden had finished going wild. Ruth was 17 then, old enough to stand in the kitchen while strangers opened drawers, but not old enough for anyone to ask what should be kept. The funeral had been small, with folding chairs in the church basement and ham biscuits wrapped in wax paper. Her mother signed papers at a round table while a cousin from Staunton spoke of taxes, liens, and the cost of keeping land nobody could afford. Ruth watched men carry things out of the shed and load them into pickups for auction. The iron hooks went, the paddles went. The ledger books went into a box marked mixed paper. Elias's kettle was too heavy for the first truck, so it sat near the shed door in a patch of late sun until a man with a flatbed came for it on Wednesday. Ruth kept only a chipped brown bottle with a cork stopper, because it had rolled beneath the workbench and been missed. Inside was a teaspoon of pearl grey powder labelled in Elias's careful hand. Apple ash, October, slow fire. She wrapped it in a sock and carried it with her through every move that followed. It was not useful. That was why she loved it. The man who later sent her out into the night was not the sort people would have called a villain from a distance. His name was Glenn Harkey, and he married Ellen 3 years after Elias was buried. He worked maintenance for a storage company outside Harrisonburg, kept his hair clipped close, and wiped his boots before entering the house. He did not raise his voice in public. He paid the electric bill on time when he could, kept a plastic folder of warranties and insurance forms, and had the clean, airless manner of a man who believed order and mercy were enemies. Glenn disliked loose ends, a coat over a chair, a cup left in the sink, a young woman working irregular shifts at a diner while taking community college classes she could not always afford. Ruth had tried for a while to be smaller in his house. She washed her plate before he noticed it. She kept her books stacked beneath her bed. She left for work early and came home by the back door when the porch boards were less likely to announce her. The harder she worked at taking up no room, the more visible she became. He did not mock her grandfather outright. That would have been too warm an act, too personal. Instead, he referred to Elias's craft as mess, dust, nonsense, hillbilly chemistry, the sort of dead work that kept people poor. Once when Ruth was cleaning the old brown bottle, Glenn held it between 2 fingers and read the label with his mouth pressed flat. "You carry ashes around like money," he said, and set it on the counter just hard enough for the glass to ring. Her mother, standing near the stove, did not turn. By the fall of 2022, the house had grown colder in ways that did not depend on weather. Ruth's hours at the diner had been cut after the owner's niece came home from college and needed shifts. The landlord raised the rent. Glenn began leaving real estate flyers on the kitchen table, not because they could buy a house, but because he liked to circle numbers and talk about who was pulling weight. Ellen moved through those evenings with her shoulders drawn in, carrying laundry, stirring soup, wiping surfaces already clean. The eviction from her family's rented duplex happened on October 3rd, 2022, though nobody in the house used that word. Ruth came home after the lunch shift with the smell of fryer oil in her hair and a paper bag of day-old rolls the cook had let her take. Her satchel strap had worn a red line into her shoulder. On the porch beside the door sat her blue plastic laundry basket. Inside were 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts, a cracked hairbrush, her work shoes, a notebook, the old brown bottle wrapped in a dish towel, and the photograph of her father still tucked into the hymnal. Her winter coat was folded on top, though the day was warm enough that yellow jackets hovered near the porch rail. Glenn opened the door before she touched the knob. He had one hand on the frame and one hand closed around her key. Behind him, the hallway looked freshly swept. "You cannot live under my roof any more." 8 words. He said them as if reading a line from a notice already posted. Ruth looked past him to her mother. Ellen stood at the far end of the hall with a towel in her hands, twisting it once, then folding it, then twisting it again. Her face had gone flat in the manner Ruth knew best, the look she wore when a bill collector called or a police siren passed too near the house. Ruth waited for her to speak. Ellen did not. She lowered her eyes to the towel and pressed one corner into the other until the cloth made a tight square. There are silences that ask forgiveness, and there are silences that sign the paper. Ruth understood the difference before she wanted to. She picked up the basket. Glenn placed the key on top of the coat, not in her hand. The small metal sound it made against the zipper pull stayed with her longer than the words. She carried everything to the sidewalk in 2 trips. On the second trip, her mother had disappeared from the hallway. A curtain moved once in the front window, then became still. For 6 weeks, Ruth lived by subtraction. First she subtracted pride. She slept 2 nights on a church basement cot in Harrisonburg, beneath a bulletin board filled with paper angels cut by children. The woman checking names at the door gave her a towel and told her breakfast was at 6:30. Ruth thanked her and slept with her satchel under her knees because the room was full of people holding the last of what they owned. Then she subtracted comfort in Staunton. She spent 4 nights in a laundromat that stayed open around the clock, pretending to wait for a dryer that had finished long before midnight. The machines breathed warm air into the room, and the floor trembled when they spun. A man in a green coat snored beside the vending machine. Ruth learned which attendant looked away and which one called the police. Then she subtracted certainty. She rode a bus to Lexington because a diner there had posted help wanted in the window, but the position had been filled that morning. She bought peanut butter, crackers, and a bruised apple from a grocery near the college and ate behind the library, where students passed with backpacks and bright cups of coffee. Rain came that evening, thin and cold. She slept beneath the covered entrance of a closed insurance office with one arm through the strap of her satchel and woke before dawn to the sound of a street sweeper. Her money diminished in exact, unforgiving numbers. $38.17 became $31.42 after the first bus ticket, $27.90 after food, $21.10 after she washed her clothes. She wrote each amount in the back of her notebook because Elias had taught her that what is not recorded becomes easier to lose. By the time she reached Elkins, she had $11.06, 2 clean shirts, 1 pair of socks without holes, and a cough that settled in her chest whenever the night air sharpened. In Elkins, she slept once in the hallway outside a women's restroom at the bus depot, once in a hay barn north of town after walking until her legs shook, and once in the waiting room of a small clinic where the receptionist let her sit. Because Ruth kept saying she was early for an appointment that did not exist, a nurse with silver hair gave her a paper cup of water and did not ask for a name. That kindness was so careful and so brief that Ruth nearly cried into the cup, but she swallowed instead and thanked her plainly. She did not call her mother. She did not go back. Some doors, once closed from the other side, teach a person the shape of her own feet. On the 41st day, Ruth went into the Elkins Randolph County Public Library because the rain had begun before noon and because libraries allowed a person to be poor without explaining it. The building smelled of paper, damp wool, and floor polish. She chose a table near the local history shelves, not because she wanted history, but because that corner had a heating vent beneath it. Her shoes were wet through, and she placed them neatly together under the chair, hoping no one would notice the steam rising faintly from her socks. She read the classified board because it was something to do while her clothes dried against her skin. There were index cards for firewood, piano lessons, laying hens, a lost orange cat, a church rummage sale, and a man seeking someone to repair a stone wall in exchange for venison. Near the bottom, held by one brass tack, was a county notice printed in plain black type. Abandoned industrial parcel. Former potash works and outbuilding. Mill Creek District. Hazardous condition. Transfer available for $1 to private party assuming liability and restoration burden prior to demolition schedule. Ruth read it once as a stranger would read it. Then she read it again as Elias's granddaughter. The phrase former potash works seemed to darken the paper around it. She touched the edge of the notice with one finger, careful not to pull it free. There was a parcel number, a clerk's office address, and a line stating that interested parties should appear in person before Friday at 4 o'clock. That day was Thursday. Her remaining money counted under the table was $7.39. The trip would cost most of it if she could find the right bus and walk the rest. She sat there until the heating vent clicked off. Outside, traffic made a wet sound along the street. A child laughed somewhere near the picture books. An older man turned a newspaper page with a dry whisper. Ruth took out her notebook and copied the notice word for word, including the parcel number, the office hours, and the warning printed in capital letters across the bottom. Structure unsafe. County assumes no responsibility after transfer. She did not feel brave. She felt exact. That evening in the library restroom, she washed her face with cold water and combed her hair with the cracked brush from the laundry basket. She changed into her least wrinkled shirt, wrapped the brown bottle more tightly, and put her father's photograph inside the back cover of her notebook. Then she sat beneath the covered entrance until the library closed and watched the rain loosen into mist. At dawn, she bought the cheapest bus ticket she could, folded the county notice into her coat pocket, and turned toward the village whose name she had only seen in old road atlases and government forms. By the time Ruth reached the edge of Mill Creek, the last of her coins were making a tired sound in her pocket, and somewhere beyond the wet trees and the narrow road, a forgotten building was waiting without mercy and without welcome. The bus left Ruth at a pull-out beside a two-lane road where the painted lines had thinned to a tired yellow and the ditch water moved under skim ice. It was 31 degrees by the bank sign in Elkins when she boarded, and the driver told her it would be colder in the low places where fog settled before the sun could get its hands on the fields. He had a face shaved too close, and a paper cup of coffee balanced beside the gear shift. Ruth sat 3 rows from the front with her satchel against her ribs, watching bare sycamores pass in a grey procession. The bus heater sighed in fits. At every stop, older men climbed on with grocery bags. A woman in a purple coat carried a prescription sack, and 2 boys in hooded sweatshirts leaned together over a cracked phone until the signal disappeared. By late afternoon, the bus turned south and left her near a church with a white steeple and a cemetery climbing the hill behind it. The driver pointed with 2 fingers toward a road that narrowed between pasture and timber. "County office is still 6 miles, he said. "Maybe more, depending where you count from." "Yes," Ruth said. "You got somebody coming?" She adjusted the satchel strap. "I can walk." The driver looked at her shoes, then at the sky. He did not argue. He reached behind his seat, took out a folded county map with a coffee stain in one corner, and marked a crooked line with a pen that skipped. "Stay left at the feed mill, right where the creek bends if you see the old school you went too far." Ruth thanked him and stepped down into the cold. The bus pulled away with a damp roar, and then the country gathered back around her. It was not silent. It had the winter sounds of a place still working beneath itself. Water running under roadside ice, a crow calling from a fence post, a loose strip of tin tapping against a shed roof, far cattle bawling from a field Ruth could not see. She walked with her hands tucked into her coat sleeves and the map folded in her pocket, following the road as it bent through low pasture and then climbed toward timber. Her feet hurt before the 3rd mile. By the 4th, one heel had opened again where the shoe rubbed, and she could feel warmth inside the sock that might have been blood, or simply the body answering cold with pain. Twice she stepped off the road for passing trucks. One carried hay, its load tied with orange cord. Another had 2 men in the cab, both wearing caps, and they slowed enough to look but not enough to offer. Ruth kept her face forward. The mountains stood around her in dark folds, not tall in the Western way, but intimate and enclosing, as if the land had hands cupped around every hollow. The light failed before she reached the office. She knew then that the map and the driver's kindness had not been enough. The road signs were scarce, and where the creek turned back on itself, 3 lanes appeared instead of 2. She chose the one with tire marks and came after half a mile upon a barn set back from the road under a line of black locust trees. The doors hung open a foot. No house light showed. The field gate was tied with baling twine. Ruth stood at the road a long while, listening. No dog barked. No engine turned. The air had sharpened until each breath made a small ache behind her nose. She crossed the field and stepped through the barn door as carefully as if entering church. Inside, the smell of hay and cold animals remained, though no animals were there. Dust lay over the rails. A broken feed bucket rested upside down near one stall, and a swallow nest, long empty, clung under a beam like a dark cup. She climbed to the loft by a ladder worn smooth in the middle of each rung. There was loose hay in one corner, not clean enough for bedding, but better than boards. Ruth shook out her coat, wrapped the satchel strap around her wrist, and lay down with her knees pulled close. Through a gap in the siding she could see one strip of sky, hard and clear. The temperature fell to 26 degrees before midnight, though she had no thermometer to tell her so. She knew by the way her toes stopped hurting and became distant, by the white crust forming on the edge of a nail hole where her breath found the plank. Near dawn a truck passed on the road, and Ruth woke with hay against her cheek and the old brown bottle safe beneath her coat. She climbed down stiffly, brushed straw from her hair, and left the barn as she had found it. On a fence post near the gate she placed one of the day-old rolls she had been saving, wrapped in its paper napkin. It was not payment, it was an apology. By 9:30 she reached the village. Mill Creek was not the kind of place that announced itself. It gathered by degrees. First a row of mailboxes, then a clapboard house with smoke coming from a chimney, then the narrow front of a hardware store with shovels hanging under the awning, then a main street that looked as if the century had passed over it with a gentle but indifferent hand. There was Lawson's Hardware, its windows crowded with stovepipe, canning lids, and bags of rock salt. There was the Mill Creek Cafe, with a hand-lettered sign promising meatloaf on Thursdays and pie when available. There was Spruce Valley Feed and Seed, where cracked corn sacks were stacked beside a scale old enough to belong in a photograph. There was a laundromat with 4 machines visible through fogged glass and a vending machine humming outside under a metal hood. There was Boyd's Barber and Tax Service, an arrangement Ruth did not understand but accepted as local fact. A post office occupied one end of a brick building that also held the county clerk's satellite office. The American flag outside hung limp in the cold. Someone had salted the steps, and the salt had been tracked inside in white crescents across the dark linoleum. Ruth paused before the door, not from hesitation exactly, but because she knew the look of official places. They had counters, they had forms, they had people who could refuse you without raising their voice. She smoothed her hair with both hands, touched the folded notice in her pocket, and went in. The room was warmer than the street and smelled of paper, toner, old wood, and the faint metallic odour of radiator heat. There were 3 chairs against one wall, a corkboard crowded with public notices, and a counter with a bell set beside a plastic holder of pens on chains. Behind the counter stood file cabinets the colour of wet clay, each drawer labelled in black block letters. A calendar from a funeral home hung slightly crooked near an office door. A woman at a desk looked up over reading glasses. She was perhaps in her late 60s, with hair pinned in a silver roll at the back of her head, and a cardigan the colour of dry moss buttoned unevenly over a white blouse. Her nameplate read MRS, Adeline Prout, Deputy Clerk. The plate had been polished so often that the brass showed soft at the corners. One of her hands rested on a stack of deeds. The other held a pencil sharpened nearly to nothing. "Can I help you?" Ruth stepped to the counter and unfolded the notice. "I came about the abandoned parcel." Mrs. Pruitt did not reach for it right away. Her eyes moved once over Ruth's coat, her satchel, her wet shoes, and the red place near her heel. Not unkindly. Not softly either. Then she took the notice and lowered her glasses by a 1/4 inch. The Potash Works. Yes, ma'am. That notice has been up 3 months. I saw it yesterday. Mrs. Pruitt made no comment on this. She rose slowly enough that Ruth heard one knee object and went to the file cabinets. She opened a drawer marked Industrial Old Tax Forfeit and drew out a folder tied with faded cotton tape. The folder looked as if it had been handled by several generations of careful hands and one careless one. She brought it back, untied it, and laid the papers on the counter between them. You understand this is not a house. Yes. Ma'am. You understand there is no certificate of occupancy. Yes. Ma'am. You understand the county has posted it unsafe. Yes. Ma'am. You understand there is no water connection. No electric service, no septic record we can confirm, and no promise the chimney will stand through the first hard wind. Yes, ma'am. You understand that if you take title, the county will not come patch your roof, remove debris, level the floor, or Ruth's fingers rested on the edge of the counter. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Pruitt studied her a moment. And you understand that $1 does not mean free. Ruth looked down at the notice, then at the woman's careful face. I do. The deputy clerk leaned back in her chair. Outside the office window, a pickup rolled slowly past, its tires making a wet hush on the street. Most people hear $1 and think they have found a trick against the world. Then they see the place. Then they come back angry, wanting somebody else to be responsible for the truth. I am not angry, Ruth said. No, Mrs. Pruitt replied. You look tired. The words were not pity. That made them easier to bear. Mrs. Pruitt opened the top paper and turned it so Ruth could read. The deed description was long and exact, full of lines, stakes, bearings, creek references, and terms that had survived from older surveys. Ruth recognized only fragments: Mill Creek District, former works lot, Ash Leach Yard, Kettle House, right of access along County Maintenance Road until such time as vacated. The clerk took a form from beneath the counter and placed it beside the deed. Print your full legal name. Ruth printed slowly. Ruth Alma Bell. The letters looked plain and exposed on the line. Mrs. Pruitt's pencil stopped. Bell, she said. Ruth lifted her eyes. The clerk did not speak for several seconds. Then she opened another drawer, smaller than the others, and searched among index cards banded with rubber. What was your people's place? I do not have a place now. That is not what I asked. Ruth swallowed. My grandfather lived near Franklin. Elias Bell. Mrs. Pruitt's expression changed only by a little, but in a face so practiced at public neutrality, the little was enough. She set the index cards down and rested both hands on the counter. Elias Bell used to come through here in the 70s, she said. Brought lye soap to my mother at Christmas. Wrapped in brown paper. She said it was the only soap that did not trouble her hands. Ruth stood very still. He knew the old trades, Mrs. Pruitt continued. Not for show. Not for festivals. He knew them because somebody had bothered to teach him right. She tapped the deed lightly with one finger. He ever mention this works? Ruth searched her memory. The shed, the kettle, the ledger books, her grandfather's voice telling her that Ash remembered the tree better than people did. Not by name. Maybe he had his reasons. The office seemed to settle around them. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. Somewhere behind the wall, a pipe ticked in the heat. Mrs. Pruitt returned to her chair and drew out the deed packet. She took from a drawer a brass stamp mounted on a black handle. It was the kind of object that did not need to be decorative to be beautiful. Its edges were hand-worn, its base darkened by ink and years. She aligned the paper, pressed the stamp into a red pad, and brought it down with a deliberate final sound. The stamp struck the counter like a small door closing. Ruth felt the sound travel through her fingers. "That is the transfer acknowledgement," Mrs. Pruitt said. "You will owe the filing fee when the tax office finishes processing, but not today. Today the statutory consideration is $1. Ruth reached into her coat pocket and took out her last paper dollar. It had been folded twice and softened from handling. She placed it on the counter. Mrs. Pruitt did not take it immediately. "You sure you want to part with that?" "It is the price." "Yes," the clerk said. "It is." She slid the bill into a narrow drawer beneath the ledger, then wrote a receipt in a hand as careful as fence wire. She handed Ruth the deed copy, a liability acknowledgement, and a thin envelope with the parcel map inside. "Directions," Mrs. Pruitt said, turning the map toward her. "You go south on Main until it stops pretending to be Maine, cross the creek bridge, take the county road marked Old Tygart Trace for just under 2 miles. You will pass a white house with a blue pump at the road, then a cattle gap, then 3 walnut trees close together. The drive is after that, but you may miss it because the laurel has taken both sides." "Old Tygart Trace," Ruth repeated. "Yes." The road used to carry wagon traffic toward Huttonsville before the state improved the other route. Do not go after dark if you can help it. There is a washout near the second bend. Ruth folded the map with care. "Thank you." Mrs. Pruitt opened a desk drawer and took out something wrapped in brown paper. She hesitated, then set it on the counter. "This is not from the county." Ruth did not touch it. "It is a biscuit," Mrs. Pruitt said. "From my lunch. Ham inside. I do not care for ham today." Ruth looked at the package until the paper blurred. She blinked once. "Hard. I can pay you later." "No," Mrs. Pruitt said. "You can eat it now." So Ruth ate half standing near the counter and wrapped the other half again because habit was stronger than hunger. Mrs. Pruitt pretended to study a form while she did. When Ruth finished, the clerk took the public notice from the corkboard, folded it, and handed it to her with the rest of the papers. "Miss Bell." "Yes, ma'am. If the roof is as poor as I think it is, do not sleep under the north slope." Ruth nodded. "And if you find anything that looks like county records, bring them back." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Pruitt's mouth tightened, though not unpleasantly. "If you find anything that looks like belonging, that is yours to decide." Ruth placed the deed packet inside her satchel, between the notebook and the brown bottle. It gave the satchel a new weight, though the papers were light. She stepped outside into the late morning cold with ownership pressed against her side and no clear idea yet whether ownership was a shelter or simply another name for responsibility. Mill Creek's Main Street had grown busier by then. A man in a canvas jacket carried feed sacks from Spruce Valley to a truck. The cafe door opened, releasing the smell of coffee, onions, and something frying in bacon fat. In Lawson's Hardware, a woman was arranging seed packets in a spinning rack, though winter had barely started. Ruth wanted to go inside to ask about nails, tar paper, chimney brushes, lamp oil, the cost of everything she could not yet buy. Instead she turned south, saving even curiosity for later. Main Street narrowed beyond the barber shop. The sidewalk ended without ceremony. Houses stood farther apart, some painted, some weathered into the color of rain. A brown dog with white feet followed her from one yard to the next, keeping 6 paces behind, stopping whenever she stopped. He had one ear up and one folded over, and he regarded her with the solemn interest of an animal who had seen strangers come and go but had never been asked to judge them. At the third mailbox, an older man stacking firewood called the dog back. "Buster," he said. "Leave her walk." The dog gave Ruth one last look, then returned through the ditch as if he had discharged his duty. The creek came into view where the road dipped, running over stones with a cold glassy sound. The bridge was narrow, with rust along the guardrails and weeds caught in the seams. Ruth paused in the middle and looked down. Water moved brown and silver under the boards, carrying leaves, foam, and one pale stick that turned slowly as it passed beneath her. Beyond the bridge, the road became Old Tygart Trace. A sign confirmed it, though the letters were flecked with lichen and one bolt had loosened so the metal leaned to the right. The white house with the blue pump appeared after half a mile. A woman in a green coat stood on the porch shaking a rug. She watched Ruth pass without waving, then turned the rug over and shook it again. Farther on, the cattle gap crossed the road with a rattle beneath Ruth's shoes. The land rose there, timber closing in on both sides. The trees were mostly bare, but the laurel held its waxy leaves, making the roadside seem guarded even in winter. Crows moved through the upper branches, their bodies heavy and deliberate against the pale sky. She found the 3 walnut trees exactly where Mrs. Pruitt had said they would be. They stood together near a bend old enough to have grown around their own injuries. Trunks ridged and dark, limbs reaching over the road like arms that had forgotten whether they were warning or blessing. Their fallen leaves lay black in the ditch. The smell beneath them was sharp and bitter, the old clean scent of hulls rotting into soil. The drive was nearly invisible. Ruth passed it once and had to turn back. 2 stone posts, one fallen and one leaning, marked the entrance. Between them a track disappeared into laurel, briars, and saplings grown up through gravel. She pushed through on foot, holding branches aside with her forearm. Thorns caught her coat. Once a hidden root took her toe and sent her forward onto one hand, the deed packet knocking against her ribs. She got up slowly and brushed mud from her palm. After 50 yards, the trees opened. The Potash works stood in a shallow clearing above the creek, lower and wider than she had imagined, built as if the first maker had trusted stone more than fashion. The main structure measured perhaps 32 feet by 24, though one side had sagged enough to make all numbers uncertain. The foundation was fieldstone, laid without vanity and with more skill than the roof deserved. The walls were a mixture of hand-hewn chestnut framing, weathered plank, and later patches of tin nailed over places where time had entered. Moss grew along the north sill. The roof was steep, split cedar under rusted sheet metal, with 2 seams lifted like loose scales. A brick chimney rose from the rear room, broad at the base and narrow above the roof line, its top listing toward the creek. Above the door hung the sign. At first, Ruth could not read it. Lichen and weather had softened the letters, and one end of the board had dropped lower than the other. She stepped closer, wiping the surface with her sleeve. Slowly the words appeared, carved shallow but still present. Bell and Merritt Potash Works. The name struck her in the chest more deeply than sense allowed. Bell was common enough in mountain counties. She knew that. It could have belonged to anyone. It could have meant nothing. Still, the letters held the same plain shape her grandfather had used when labelling bottles. Not exactly, but near enough that her hand rose without permission and rested against the sign's lower edge. The door below it was made of vertical planks bound by 2 cross braces. It had swollen and shrunk through so many seasons that its bottom corner no longer met the sill. A chain had been looped through the latch, but the lock was only a county warning seal, thin metal stamped with numbers and already rusted at the hinge. Ruth had been given permission to remove it. Even so, she took the notice from her satchel and checked the parcel number once more. Then she broke the seal with a stone. The sound was small. Inside, the air came out to meet her. It was cold, mineral, and stale, with the deep scent of ash underneath everything. Not fresh ash from a hearth, but something older, held in wood grain and brick paws and the dark between floorboards. Dust stirred where the door opened. Light entered behind Ruth in a narrow sheet and showed a front room crowded with the remains of use. There was a rough counter along the left wall, a table with one leg splintered by wire, shelves holding cracked jars, 2 empty nail kegs, a broken chair, a coil of rope gone stiff with age, and a broom that had lost half its straw. The floorboards were wide, some cupped, some split, and they answered each step with a different complaint. She stood listening until the building settled around her. The roof dripped in 2 places, though no rain was falling. Meltwater from an earlier frost had found its way through and was falling into a rusted pan. Someone had left years before. Plink. Then silence. Plink. The sound made the room feel inhabited by a clock too slow to trust. Ruth moved carefully, testing each board before giving it weight. Against the far wall, a doorway opened into the back room. The smell changed there. It grew stronger, heavier, touched with iron, soot, lime, and damp brick. This was the working room. She knew before she saw the kettle base. The ash kettle sat in the centre like a blackened altar. The iron itself was gone, perhaps sold, stolen, or hauled away for scrap decades before, but the brick setting remained, a circular base 4 feet across with a firebox below, ash pit to one side, and a low flue mouth leading toward the chimney. Around it were work surfaces built into the walls, a leach tub collapsed in on itself, and a long trough darkened by stains that no ordinary washing would remove. A wooden paddle lay on the floor beneath the table, broken near the handle. Ruth crouched and touched the break. The wood was dry and light as bone. She did not explore further that first hour. Hunger and cold had made her slow, and the place required slowness. She returned to the front room, cleared a space near the inner wall away from the north slope, as Mrs. Pruitt had warned, and took inventory of what she had. Satchel, notebook, coat, 2 shirts, cracked brush, brown bottle, deed papers, half a ham biscuit, a pencil, 1 matchbook with 4 matches, and coins amounting to 64 cents. No blanket, no lamp, no fire yet. Outside, dusk came early under the trees. Ruth gathered fallen branches from the clearing, though most were damp, and stacked them near the door to dry, by hope alone. She found an old burlap sack beneath the counter, shook out mouse leavings and spread it over the floor where the boards seemed least cruel. From the front room window, whose glass was cracked but holding, she could see the 3 walnut trees down by the road in a tangle of dark limbs. Beyond them, the village had already drawn its lights inward. For supper she ate the rest of Mrs. Pruitt's biscuit in 5 small bites, saving the paper because it was clean and could be useful. She drank from the creek after breaking a skin of ice near the bank, and filling a tin cup she found on the shelf, though she boiled nothing because there was no fire safe enough yet. The water made her teeth ache. She wiped the cup with the inside of her coat and set it upside down on the counter. Night inside the Potash works did not arrive all at once. It gathered in corners, under tables, inside the empty firebox, along the rafters where old spider threads held dust like grey wool. The building spoke more after dark. A board ticked, tin shifted on the roof. Somewhere in the wall a mouse made a careful journey. The chimney breathed when the wind came down from the ridge, and for a moment Ruth could almost hear a kettle lid tremble, a paddle scrape, a man's low instruction spoken to a child. She lay on the burlap with her coat over her chest and her satchel under her head. The cold came up through the boards and entered her bones with deliberate fingers. She did not sleep for a long time. Instead, she watched the doorway to the back room, where the kettle base stood unseen but present, holding the dark in a shape she could feel. Before dawn she woke to frost silvering the inside edge of the window and a pale line of morning entering through the torn roof seam. Her breath rose and vanished. She sat up slowly, every part of her stiff, and listened to the creek running beyond the wall, to the crows beginning their first rough calls, to the patient, waiting silence of a building that had taken her in without promising to spare her. The house was not empty. It had been waiting. By the 3rd morning, Ruth knew which floorboards could be trusted before sunrise and which ones needed daylight. She learned the room the way a person learns a new country under poor conditions, by error, by soreness, by the exact memory of where the body had been hurt. The plank nearest the front door bowed at the middle and snapped back with a hollow complaint. The one beside the counter held firm if she stepped along its left edge. In the back room, 2 boards near the leach trough had gone soft beneath damp rot, and she marked them with pieces of broken chalk found in a drawer, drawing careful X marks that looked too bright against the dust. Water came from the creek 27 steps from the back threshold if she took the direct path, and 34 if she avoided the slick stones. The tin cup she had found was not enough, so she cleaned a cracked stoneware jug with creek sand, shook it until her arms ached, rinsed it 7 times, and let it stand upside down overnight on the counter. There was a well on the parcel, or the shape of one, half hidden by bracken near the walnut trees. It had a circular stone curb and a warped wooden cover weighted with a flat rock. Ruth did not lift it. The boards had blackened at the edges, and she had learned young that old wells should be approached with a respect bordering on fear. The outhouse stood beyond a screen of laurel, leaning but upright, its door held shut by a leather strap so stiff with weather that it cracked when she touched it. Inside, a wasp nest hung empty from the corner, grey and delicate as old paper. Ruth swept it out with a branch and propped the door open to air. There was no dignity in the arrangement. But there was privacy, and privacy, after weeks of public restrooms and borrowed corners, felt like a form of shelter. Each morning she made a circuit: front room, back room, door, creek, outhouse, woodpile, roof drip, chimney base. She wrote everything in her notebook. North wall lean unchanged. Roof seam dripping less after frost. Mouse sound east wall only. Chimney throat blocked unknown depth. Firebox full of bird nest and old soot. No smell of gas, no wire live, no glass falling. Her grandfather had taught her to record before repairing because the act of writing slowed panic into sequence. On the 4th day, she walked back into the village to find out what the price of survival would be. Lawson's Hardware sat between the cafe and the feed store, its front windows so crowded that Ruth had to stop and study them one pane at a time. There were galvanized buckets stacked like nested moons, axe handles hanging from wire, jars of screws arranged by size, paraffin blocks, lamp wicks, red shop rags, stove polish, 2 cast-iron skillets, a row of mousetraps, and a handwritten sign reading "Roof cement kept warm inside." When she opened the door, a bell rang above her head, not brightly, but with the tired courtesy of something that had announced the same threshold for decades. The air smelled of pine shavings, kerosene, metal, coffee, and seed potatoes. Narrow aisles ran between shelves that climbed higher than Ruth could reach. The floor had been oiled so many times that it reflected window light in dark patches. Near the back, beside a counter scarred by tools and coins, stood a man with white hair combed straight back from his forehead and a measuring pencil tucked behind one ear. He wore a red flannel shirt buttoned to the throat and suspenders that had lost their stretch. The name stitched over his pocket read W. Lawson, though the stitching had faded. He looked up from weighing nails on a hanging scale. "Morning." "Morning," Ruth said. His eyes moved once to her shoes, which were still damp, then to the paper in her hand. "You the Bell girl at the works?" The question did not sound unkind, but it startled her. "I am Ruth Bell. Adeline Pruitt called after you left. He poured nails into a paper sack and folded the top twice. Said somebody finally took that building off the county's conscience." Ruth stood near a rack of stove gaskets. "I need to know what things cost. That is a serious need." He set the nail sack aside. "Roof, chimney, glass, or food?" She looked down at her list. "Chimney first. Then roof, if it waits that long." "Roof never waits. It only appears to." He came around the counter with a limp that seemed old and settled. "Not painful so much as permanent. But a chimney can kill you in one night if it is blocked wrong."
"What shape?"
"Brick. Back room. Broad base. Firebox below. Flue to the stack. I have not lit it." "Good. I cleared loose nest from the firebox, but the throat is heavy with soot. I do not know how far. Any shine to it. Black shine in places. Creosote." He reached for a chimney brush from the wall. "You do not burn under that until it is clean. Not a handful of twigs. Not paper. Not for warmth. You hear me? Yes." He took down 3 brushes before finding one narrow enough. "That stack may have 2 bends if it was built for a kettle draft. You will need rods. Used ones are cheaper. Might splinter your hands if you're careless. I can be careful. Careful is not the same as safe. No." The corner of his mouth shifted, almost but not quite a smile. He returned to the counter and took out a ledger book bound in cracked black cloth. You got cash. Not enough. Work. Not yet. Family backing. No. He opened the ledger to a blank line and wrote her name anyway. Then we will make this a credit account. Ruth did not move. Mr. Lawson dipped the pen again. Not large. Do not mistake me for a bank. You will sign for what you take, and you will pay when work finds you or when the place starts yielding something better than rainwater. I do not know when that will be. No honest account ever starts with knowing. He slid the ledger toward her. Write your name. She wrote Ruth Alma Bell beneath his line, and the letters looked different there than they had at the clerk's office. Less exposed, more held. He reached beneath the counter and brought up a book with a cracked spine and pages swollen from damp. The cover read, Home Repair for Farm Buildings, 1958 edition. A ring from a coffee cup darkened the title. This is free, he said. Not because it is worthless, because it is out of date in some ways and still truer than half the new ones. Read the chimney chapter twice. Roof chapter 3 times. Ignore the wiring section unless you want to meet your maker early. Ruth took it with both hands. Thank you. Do not thank me until it helps. Together they made the first list, and Mr. Lawson wrote prices beside each item in pencil. Used chimney brush, $4.50. 6 fiberglass rods, $2 each, but he marked 3 of them damaged and charged half. Dust mask, $1.75. Work gloves with a split cuff, $2. Tin of stove cement, $3.29. Wire brush, 98 cents. Flashlight batteries, $1.10, though he gave her mismatched brands from an opened box. A small bag of rock salt for the threshold ice, 75 cents. 10 pounds of 8D common nails, $1.60. 5 pounds of 16D nails, $1.25. A roll of tar paper was too expensive, so he cut her a leftover partial roll for $3. 2 candles, 15 cents each. 1 bar of yellow soap, 22 cents. A dented can of beans from the back shelf, 30 cents. He wrote the total, then looked at it, crossed out the brush price, and wrote loaner beside it. You bring that back when the flue is clean, he said. Yes. And do not climb on that roof alone. I do not have a ladder. Then you especially do not climb it. She packed the supplies so the rods lay across her shoulder and the nails balanced the book in her satchel. Before she left, Mr. Lawson took a folded pamphlet from a drawer and placed it on top. County Extension put that out years ago. Wood stove safety. Read it before you freeze with ambition. The walk back took longer because the load pulled at her arms. At the bridge, she stopped to rest and watched the creek pass under the boards. Ice had formed around the stones in shelves, clear at the edges and cloudy toward the middle. She could feel the ledger account behind her like a hand between her shoulder blades. Debt had weight, so did trust. At the works. She began with the chimney because fear is sometimes useful when given a task. She opened both doors to keep air moving, tied her hair back with a strip torn from an old shirt, wrapped a rag across her mouth beneath the dust mask, and spread burlap around the hearth to catch soot. The firebox was knee-high and wide enough that she could reach both arms inside. She removed a second bird nest, 3 walnut shells carried there by squirrels, a flattened tin tobacco tag, and a length of charred wood so old it broke into cubes when she touched it. The first pass with the wire brush produced dry soot that fell in soft clumps. She scraped the lower throat until brick showed through in dull red patches. Then she fitted the round chimney brush to the first rod, tightened the wing screw and fed it upward. It went 3 feet before striking resistance. She twisted clockwise, as Mr. Lawson had told her, never backward enough to loosen the joint. The brush climbed an inch, stopped, then climbed again. Soot fell around her wrists. She withdrew, shook debris into a bucket, added a second rod, and fed the brush higher. By noon, her arms trembled. Creosote came down in black plates, shiny as broken lacquer, with an odor sharp enough to sting her eyes. She carried each bucket outside and dumped it in a pit away from the building. then covered it with damp soil. The work became a measure of inches. Push, twist, strike, withdraw.
Brush the rods clean. Tighten. Push again.
At one bend, the brush lodged so firmly she had to sit back on her heels, breathe through the rag, and wait until the panic passed. She remembered Elias tapping the sieve, letting the ash settle. Nothing honest is made in a hurry. By late afternoon she had added the 5th rod and reached what felt like open stack. A rush of loosened soot fell so heavily that she backed out coughing, eyes streaming, hands black to the wrists despite the gloves. She sat on the back threshold with her boots in the dead weeds and watched dark powder drift from her sleeves into the grass. The sun had gone behind the ridge. Her whole body ached in deliberate places. The next day she did it again from below, then fashioned a weighted scrape from wire and a flat piece of scrap metal, lowering it from the chimney top only after borrowing a ladder from the abandoned shed behind the works and testing every rung with stones before trusting one foot. She did not climb higher than she had to. She kept 3 points touching and did not look toward the creek from above. The chimney smelled of wet brick and long neglect. She worked the scrape down slowly, hearing it catch, free itself, and fall another few inches. When she returned inside and shone the flashlight upward, the beam rose through the throat into a narrow, clean darkness. Cleaning took 11 hours across 2 days. It changed the room. Not visibly, not to a stranger, but Ruth could feel the chimney breathe differently. Air moved through it now with a steadier pull. She sealed 2 cracks near the firebox with stove cement, smoothing the black paste with a gloved finger, then let it cure as the tin directed. She spent that waiting day gathering dry inner wood from beneath fallen branches, shaving kindling with a pocket knife Mr. Lawson had included and not written down, and arranging the first fire as if setting a table for someone exacting. On the 7th evening after she arrived, Ruth lit her first fire. She used 1 match. For a moment the flame leaned sideways, uncertain, touching the curled paper, then the shavings, then the slivers of dead pine she had split thin with a stone, and the back of the hatchet handle she had found without a head. Smoke rose, hesitated near the throat, and went upward. Not all of it. A small bitter ribbon came into the room, enough to warn her, but the greater body of it drew through the flue and vanished. The kindling took. The first twigs snapped. Heat, modest and almost unbelieved, reached her hands. Ruth stayed crouched before it until her knees hurt. She fed it no faster than the chimney would accept. Small wood, then 1 wrist-thick piece, then another after the first had settled into coal. The room changed by degrees, not becoming warm but ceasing to be entirely cold. Frost near the window loosened into beads. The smell of creosote gave way to the cleaner scent of hardwood. She ate beans heated in the tin can, holding it with a rag and stirring with a shaved stick. She had saved a pinch of salt from the biscuit paper, and the beans tasted better than anything she had eaten in weeks, because they belonged to a place where she had made the heat herself. She sat on the floor with her back against the inner wall, the candle unlit beside her, the fire showing the rafters in soft pulses above. After that, she began to inventory the workroom. She did not search as a treasure hunter searches. She recorded as Elias would have recorded, item by item, condition by condition, starting at the door and moving clockwise. South wall, collapsed leach tub, staves chestnut, hoops rusted through, false bottom missing, peg rail, 3 empty pegs, 1 iron hook intact, 1 peg broken flush, shelf 1, 2 glass jars cracked, 1 blue bottle without stopper, 1 tin scoop flattened, shelf 2, lump of lime hardened in paper, unusable, 3 hand-forged nails, mouse nest in corner, floor beneath shelf, burlap sack, unreadable stamp, dust heavy, west wall, trough length 6 feet 4 inches, interior stained grey-white, 1 end split, north corner ash rake head without handle, table 2 plank top, legs pegged, right rear foot rotted, surface burn marks, circular stain 12 inches across, chimney wall, brick kettle base, firebox swept, ash pit clear, flue drawing. She made small piles in the front room. Keep, repair, burn, unknown. Nothing was thrown outside unless it was wet beyond saving or fouled by mice. Even broken objects had information in them. The paddle head told her the stirring stroke had been broad and slow. The trough stains told her liquid had stood there often and long. The wear on the floor near the kettle base showed where workers had turned, lifted, waited, returned. Human movement had polished certain boards darker than others. On the 9th day, while testing the kettle base for loose brick, she noticed the first anomaly. The base was circular at a glance, but not perfectly. Most of the brickwork rang dull under her knuckles, a heavy masonry sound. One section near the rear, just above the ash pit and below the missing iron ring, answered differently. Not hollow in the simple way of a gap, more like wood behind brick, a kept sound, a careful silence. Ruth tapped again with the handle of the wire brush. Dull, dull, dull. Then a lower note. Smaller and contained. She wrote it down before touching anything else. Rear section, east by northeast. Different sound, possible repair, possible void. The next morning she returned with better light. She had slept badly, not from excitement but from the discipline of not rushing. Mortar between the anomalous bricks was darker than the surrounding joints, though the colour difference had been masked by soot. She brushed it gently with a dry rag. The joint line was too clean, too exact, forming a rectangle that did not follow the older courses. Someone had cut and reset those bricks with patience. She pressed each brick with both thumbs. Nothing moved. She tested weight by placing her shoulder lightly against the section and feeling for give. Nothing. She slid the flat end of the broken paddle into the ash pit and found at the back a narrow cedar disc blackened with soot and set into a groove. It was the size of a jar lid, nearly invisible unless the ash pit was clear, and a person knew how to put her cheek near the floor without minding dirt. Cedar did not belong there. Ruth lay on her side, reached into the ash pit, and touched the disc with 2 fingers. It turned a 1/4 inch, then stopped. She withdrew her hand and sat back. Her heart had begun to beat hard, but her movements stayed exact. She cleaned around the disc with a nail. There was a small notch at its edge. She fitted the nail into the notch and turned again. This time the disc rotated fully, and somewhere inside the brick base, something wooden shifted with a dry sound. The rectangular section loosened. Not fell. Loosened. She pulled one brick. It came free with a sigh of grit. Behind it was not empty space, but a fitted cedar panel darkened by age, its surface coated in ash to disguise it. 2 finger holes had been bored near the bottom. Ruth cleared them with the nail, hooked 2 fingers inside and drew the panel toward her. It resisted at first, then released, bringing with it the smell of cedar, dust and air that had been waiting longer than any person in the village had been alive. Inside the compartment were packages wrapped in oilcloth. Ruth did not touch them for several minutes. She knelt before the opening while the morning light moved across the floor behind her. The fire was unlit. The room was cold enough to stiffen her fingers, but sweat gathered under her arms. She could see 3 bundles, maybe 4, stacked with care. The top one had been tied with linen tape gone brown at the edges. Beside it rested a tin box no larger than a book, and beneath the box, wrapped separately, the curved handle of a tool showed through a tear in the cloth. She brought the packages out one at a time and laid them on the table. The first held heirloom tools, a small ash rake with a hand-smoothed hickory handle, a brass skimmer pierced with neat holes greened at the rim but sound, a set of wooden test paddles labelled by depth marks, a narrow iron ladle, a folded apron stiff with age patched at the pocket and smelling faintly of smoke. Each object had been oiled before storage. Whoever hid them had not abandoned them. They had prepared them to survive. The second bundle held raw material, not much, but enough to speak. 3 sealed glass jars packed in straw, hardwood ash, pearl ash, and a finer white powder labelled refined potash, second boil, a paper twist of dried soapwort, a small sack of lime, 2 corked vials whose labels had browned beyond easy reading. Ruth handled them as she would have handled eggs. The third bundle was heavier. Inside was the tin box, wrapped first in oilcloth, then in a square of faded blue cotton. The box had no lock, only a clasp stiff with rust. Ruth did not open it immediately. She cleaned the table with a rag, set the candle near the window, though it was daytime, and washed her hands in creek water until the black loosened from her nails. Then she returned, sat in the broken chair after testing its legs, and lifted the clasp. The box opened with a small scrape. Money lay inside, bundled in paper, separated by type, each packet labelled in the same careful hand. There were silver dollars, half-dollars, quarters, dimes, paper notes folded flat, and 2 small cloth purses tied with thread. Ruth looked at them as she might have looked at a nest of sleeping animals. She had never seen money gathered so quietly. Money in her life had always passed through hands already claimed by need. Rent, gas, food, medicine, bus fare. Here it sat still, not loud, not new, not asking to be spent. She closed the lid. Then she opened it again because refusing to count would not make the truth kinder. She counted on the table in rows, writing each sum in the notebook. The silver dollars came first, Morgan's worn smooth at the cheek. Peace dollars with eagles softened by years of handling, dates ranging from 1881 to 1935. There were 47 of them. The half-dollars included Walking Liberty pieces and Franklin halves, their edges dark with age. The quarters were mostly Washingtons, but 2 standing Liberty coins appeared, thin and beautiful, the dates nearly gone. The dimes were Mercuries in paper rolls marked not bank but hand-counted, and a few Roosevelts from later years. The paper money took longer. $1 silver certificates, $5 red seals, $10 notes from years she had to hold close to the window to read. Some were crisp, most folded, all kept dry. In one cloth purse were pennies and nickels, including Indian head cents, wheat cents, and buffalo nickels with the animals rubbed nearly flat. In the other was a military medal on a faded ribbon wrapped separately in cotton. The bronze disc bore the date, 1918, on a small engraved bar at the back, and the name Thomas Merritt Bell had been scratched into the reverse by hand. Ruth set it apart from the money without knowing why, except that it did not belong in a count. The full amount, after 3 counts and 1 correction, was $20,583.47. She wrote the number once, then again beneath it, because the first writing seemed to have been done by someone else. $10,583.47. The odd cents unsettled her more than the thousands. They made the cash human. Someone had counted every penny before closing the tin. Someone had believed that 47 cents mattered, that nothing honest should be rounded away merely because no one was watching. At the bottom of the tin box lay a handwritten journal wrapped in waxed paper, its cover dark brown, its corners softened by use. The paper had kept it from damp, though not from age. A folded letter was tucked beneath the front cover, addressed not by name, but by condition. To the one who opens the kettle. Ruth touched the words, then withdrew her hand. The room had grown dim. She had spent hours without noticing. The fire remained unlit. Her legs were stiff, her back sore, and her stomach hollow. But none of those things seemed close. She gathered the coins back into their packets exactly as she had found them, placed the medal on top of the cloth, and returned the journal to the box. The letter stayed unopened beneath its cover. She could not read it that night. Not because she was afraid of what it might say, though perhaps she was. Not because she lacked light, for 1 candle remained and 4 matches had become 3. It was because the day had already given her more than she could carry honestly. Some discoveries require a person to sleep beside them before making them speak. She placed the tin box near the inner wall, then changed her mind and set it inside the cedar compartment again without replacing the bricks. She sat before the open space for a long while, watching the dark mouth of it. Then she stood, took her coat, and went outside. The evening had settled blue over the clearing. Down the slope the creek moved between stones with a sound steady enough to lean against. Ruth walked to the bank and stood where frost stiffened the grass. The water caught the last of the sky in broken pieces and carried them away. Heron lifted from the far side, slow and prehistoric, its wings making no sound she could hear. It crossed the creek, passed above the roof of the potash works, and vanished toward the deeper trees. Ruth remained until her hands hurt from cold. She did not pray in words. She did not plan. She watched water move over stone and let the fact of the hidden tin settle into the same place in her where hunger, grief, instruction, and ash had already settled. When she went back inside, the open compartment waited in the dark, and the unopened letter lay inside the box like a voice patient enough to last another night. The house was not empty. It had been waiting. This morning came without warmth, but it came clean. The first light entered through the split roof seam and rested in a pale bar across the workroom floor, touching the chalk marks, the swept firebox, the cedar panel, and finally the edge of the tin box where Ruth had left it within reach of the open compartment. She had slept little, not poorly, exactly, but lightly, rising twice to feed a careful fire, and once to stand in the doorway while the creek spoke under the dark. By dawn the coals were red and low, the kind of heat that asked to be tended before it disappeared. She washed her hands before touching the journal. The water in the stoneware jug had gone cold enough to numb her fingers. She poured a little into the tin cup, rubbed each nail with soap, dried her hands on the inside of her shirt, and sat at the table where the surface had been cleared the evening before. The box opened more easily now, as if one night of air had loosened its old reluctance. The medal lay on top in its cotton wrap. Beneath it, the journal waited. Ruth lifted the folded letter first. The paper had yellowed evenly, not stained, and had been folded into thirds with such exact pressure that the creases still guided her fingers. On the outside, the words had been written in brown-black ink, "To the one who opens the kettle." She knew the hand before she could explain why. Not Elias's hand, though there was kinship in it. This writing was older in style, with a slight rightward lean and capital letters made as if every upward stroke mattered. Yet the plainness was familiar. No flourish for vanity, no wasted curve. Every word formed to be understood by someone whose hands might be tired. It reminded her of the labels on the ash bottle of ledgers where weather and result had been given equal dignity, of people who believed that recording was a kind of care. She unfolded the paper along its original lines. The first word stood alone at the top. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the kettle has kept its charge longer than I could keep my breath, and that is proper. Iron outlives the hand, and brick outlives the house, and a true place will sometimes hold its tongue until the right hunger comes through the door. My name is Abigail Merritt Bell. I write this on the 12th day of November 1939 from the back room of the works at Mill Creek, Randolph County, West Virginia. I'm 68 years old. 3 weeks ago, in Baltimore, Maryland, Dr. Samuel H. Reinhardt told me the trouble in my lungs is not winter weakness, nor the smoke of the old fires, nor the damp settling in my chest. He called it carcinoma and said there would be no lasting cure. He was kind in the way doctors are kind when they have already put the truth in order before you arrive. I came home by train with that truth folded in my handbag, beside a lemon drop he gave me for the cough. I do not write for pity. Pity is a soft blanket, and I have no use for one now. I write because work should not vanish merely because the worker must. Our line has been poor in money and rich in practice. And there is a difference the world forgets when it begins counting only the first thing. The first of us here was Josiah Merritt, born near Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1798, son of a cooper and a woman who could read Latin though no school had invited her to. He came south and west after the war roads opened, arriving in this valley in 1824 with 2 augers, a shaving horse, 1 Bible, and a wife named Elspeth, who had more judgment than any man on the creek. Josiah built the first leach hoppers from chestnut and sold potash to soap boilers in Staunton and glass men passing through on wagon routes. Their daughter, Naomi Merritt, born 1831, learned to test lye with an egg, a feather, and her own eye, and improved on all 3. She married Caleb Bell of Pendleton County in 1854 and kept both names in the business because she said a woman's labor should not be swept into a man's signature like ash under a rug. Naomi ran the works through the bad years when Salt, Powder and Sons were taken for war, and she did not close the kettle except on Sundays and burial days. Naomi's second son, Ezra Bell, born 1862, rebuilt the chimney after the flood of 1888 and added the rear draft you see before you. He was my father, He believed no batch should be sold unless its origin could be named, and he made ledgers of woodlot, burn time, leach depth, boil hours, and yield. If the journal is still with this letter, you hold his habit in your hands as much as mine. I, Abigail, was born in 1871 in the room above the shop, when there was still a stair and a loft. I married Thomas Merritt Bell, my cousin by distance and my companion by choice, in 1893. He was quiet, careful, and exact. We had one son, Daniel, who could split kindling finer than a pencil by the time he was 9, and who hated the smoke but loved the accounts. The day that closed this trade was October 18th, 1907. I write the date plainly because a thing without a date becomes easier for strangers to improve with lies. A rail spur opened east of the valley that year, and by autumn the merchants were buying factory alkali in barrels marked from Cincinnati and Pittsburgh. It came cheaper, whiter, and without a story attached. We boiled our last full commercial batch that Wednesday. Rain fell after noon. Father Ezra stood by the door and watched the wagon leave with 22 pounds and did not speak until evening. After that the works became occasional, soap for neighbours, ash for dyeing wool, small orders for families who trusted what they knew, then fewer, then none. For more than 30 years this building has listened to leaves gather at its door. I have opened it in spring and closed it in fall, swept the floor, oiled what could be oiled, and kept the kettle dry. People believed I was sentimental. Perhaps I was. Sentiment, when joined to duty, has saved more worthy things than commerce ever has. My husband Thomas died in 1918 after returning from service in the Great War with lungs ruined by gas near the Meuse Argonne. He came home in November and left me in February. My brother Samuel did not return from that war at all. My son Daniel lived to come back, but not whole. He moved west in 1922, saying the valley held too many ghosts, and wrote from Ohio twice before silence took him also. Do not judge him. A man may survive and still be carried away. If you mean to practice the craft, begin smaller than pride allows. Use hardwood ash only, clean burned, not trash fire, not painted wood, not pine. Unless desperation is teaching, and you're willing to learn poor results. Oak gives steadiness. Hickory gives strength. Maple is gentle but thin. Keep the ash dry after burning. Pack the leach tub in layers, coarse straw at the bottom, then clean gravel, then ash tamped by hand but not rammed hard. For every bushel of ash, pour 3 gallons of soft water heated to blood warm, not boiling. Let it percolate slow. The first draw should feel slick between thumb and finger. If it bites, it is too strong for skin and must be handled with respect, not fear. For boiling, use a clean iron kettle and a steady fire. Do not let flame lick one side higher than the other. Bring the liquor to a slow roll and keep it there. A hard boil wastes fuel and throws good matter to the rim. Skim the grey scum. Stir every 7 minutes at first, then every 3 as it thickens. When the liquor coats the paddle and leaves a pale edge as it cools, reduce heat. For pearl ash, calcine the dried salts in a covered iron pan between 600 and 700 degrees if you can judge or measure it, until the colour lightens and the damp spirit is gone. Too low leaves weakness, too high makes waste. Record weather, wood, water, time and result. Memory is a fine companion and a poor ledger. Use 1 part finished potash to 3 parts rendered fat for a strong soap base, but cut with more water if washing skin. For wool, test on scraps. For glass, sell only to someone who knows his furnace and will not blame you for his haste. Never promise purity you have not earned. Never sell what you would not place in your own wash kettle. As for the money, it is not a fortune, though it may look like one if you are cold when you find it. Some came from the last commercial orders, some from my mother's egg money, some from Thomas's service pay, which he refused to spend on himself after the war, some from neighbours who paid late and apologized, though I had not asked. I kept it here because banks close, men die, and paper promises burn. I meant it first for Daniel, then for his children, if any came, then for whoever would arrive with need enough to listen. Spend slowly. Keep most of it together. Money scattered loses its memory. The tools are not relics. They are hands waiting for hands. The powders are not charms. They are lessons sealed against damp. The medal is Thomas's, and I ask only that it not be sold. If you have no blood claim, do not trouble yourself over that. Inheritance is not always a straight line through names. Sometimes it is the passing of care from one pair of hands to another when the world has looked away. If you have been sent here by hardship, do not mistake hardship for proof that you are unwanted. Many worthy things arrive at their right place looking ruined. Ash is what remains after fire has taken everything quick and bright. From ash, if patience holds, something useful can still be drawn. I have left a marker behind the works because people forget where roots begin. Walk out the back door and find the walnut nearest the creek bend. In its south fork you will see an iron horseshoe the tree has grown around. Beneath that tree, Thomas asked me to marry him in June of 1892, and beneath that tree my father told me to keep both names on the sign. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Abigail Merritt Bell, November 12th, 1939. Ruth read the letter once without moving. Then she read it again, slower, placing one finger under the lines about ash war ledgers and the kind of inheritance that did not always travel through blood in any manner a courthouse could prove. The fire had fallen low while she read. The room around her had become colder, but she did not rise. She could feel the table edge pressing into her forearms, the rough grain of the wood beneath the paper, the thin ache in her back from sitting too still. When she reached the closing the second time, she did not weep in any visible way. Her breath changed, and one hand moved to the old brown bottle in her satchel. She took it out and set it beside the letter. Apple ash, October slow fire. Elias's handwriting faced Abigail's across the table. 2 small records of matter saved from disappearance. Ruth folded the letter along its original creases. She did not improve them. She let the paper remember where it had bent before. Then she placed it back beneath the journal cover, not hiding it, not displaying it, simply returning it to the order in which it had waited. The journal itself she opened only to the first page. Ezra Bell's ledger hand filled the paper in columns: date, wood, weather, leach strength, boil time, yield, notes. The first entry she saw was from April 3rd, 1891. Rain previous, oak and hickory mixed, slow draw, good body. Sold Mrs. Hanley £2 for soap, paid in butter and 1 repaired shirt. Ruth touched the margin but did not turn the page. There would be time for that. The letter had made time feel less like an enemy and more like a room she had been invited to enter. She rose at last and went out the back door. The morning had brightened into a hard winter clarity, frost held in the shadow of the laurel. The creek moved loud after a night of thaw, upstream brown water shouldering past stones, carrying foam and leaves and 1 pale feather that turned in the current before disappearing under a root tangle. Ruth stood on the threshold and looked for the walnut Abigail had named. There were several near the clearing, but only one grew close to the bend, its trunk divided into a low south fork and a higher north limb. She walked toward it slowly, as if approaching someone at prayer. The tree was enormous, older than the building's closed years, and perhaps older than the last commercial boil. Its bark had folded into deep black ridges. At the south fork, half swallowed by living wood, was an iron horseshoe. Time had drawn the tree around it until only the outer curve and 1 squared heel showed clearly. The iron had rusted dark red where weather touched it, but the wood around it was smooth and swollen, a wound transformed into holding. Ruth reached up and laid her palm against the trunk below the horseshoe. The bark was cold, solid, exact. She looked back at the works from there. The building appeared smaller from beneath the walnut, more vulnerable, its roof patched with rusted metal, its chimney leaning, its sign barely visible over the door. Yet from that distance she could also see why it had been built where it was, above the creek but not too far, sheltered by the slope, open enough for wagons, close to hardwood, close to road, close to the slow commerce of neighbours needing soap dye, glass and alkali. What had looked like abandonment from the drive began under Abigail's letter to resemble waiting with a purpose no one had bothered to ask about. Near the base of the tree, under leaves blackened by frost, Ruth found a flat stone half buried in soil. She cleared it with her fingers. No name was carved there, only a shallow mark, a circle with a small flame shape rising from its bottom edge. She did not know whether it had been a craft mark, a family sign, or only the private symbol of someone who wished to leave one thing less easily erased. She brushed the stone clean and placed 3 walnuts beside it, not because the dead needed walnuts, but because the living sometimes need a gesture small enough not to embarrass them. Back inside, Ruth opened the tin box again and removed the apron. Its canvas had stiffened at the folds, and the pocket patch was made from blue cotton printed with faded flowers. She shook it gently, then hung it over the chair near the fire. Beneath the apron, wrapped in a strip of linen, was a candle she had not noticed the night before. It was longer than the 2-store candles from Lawson's, hand-dipped, beeswax by the smell, its colour deepened from cream to old honey. A note tied around it read last winter's wax, "Do not waste." Last winter. Abigail's winter. More than 60 years gone by the county's closing date alone, longer by the full count of the hidden years. Ruth held it near her face and smelled faint sweetness. Smoke, dust, and something floral so slight it might have been memory rather than scent. She set the candle in a cracked iron holder found on the shelf, struck one of her 3 remaining matches, and lit it. The wick caught slowly, bending first, then straightening as the flame took. The light was small and amber, different from the sharper store candles, and it steadied after a minute into a flame that gave off the gentlest scent of honey and smoke. Ruth placed it on the table beside Elias's bottle and Abigail's letter. The 2 hands of writing lay near each other. The candle flame moved when the chimney drew, then settled again. She did not spend the day counting the money again. She did not make plans for what the money might buy. Instead, she cleaned the table, swept the hearth, laid the heirloom tools in a row on the planks, and made a new page in her notebook titled Things Kept. Beneath it she wrote, letter, journal, medal, tools, powders, candle, sign, horseshoe tree. She paused, then added, $1 deed, Mrs. Pruitt's biscuit, bus driver's map, nurse's water, Lawson's account. Those last things were not in the box, but they belonged to the same chain. The bus driver had not needed to mark the map. Mrs. Pruitt had not needed to give away her lunch or leave the filing fee for later. The nurse in Elkins had not needed to hand over a cup of water with no questions. Mr. Lawson had not needed to open a ledger for a woman whose coat smelled of smoke and rain, and who could offer him no guarantee beyond handwriting. Each kindness had been modest enough to be denied by the giver, practical enough to pass as ordinary, and yet together they had carried Ruth to a table where a dead woman's letter lay open under candlelight. If you have ever been held up by a small kindness, you know how long it can last. A sandwich folded in wax paper, a ride offered without questions, a teacher who noticed your shoes were wet and said nothing in front of the class, a neighbour who left soup by the door. Tell us, if you can, about one quiet kindness you still remember. Not the grand gesture, the small one, the one that came when you had already begun to believe nobody was looking. Stories like this are made of those moments. And sometimes another person needs to hear that the world has not gone entirely hard. By late afternoon, Ruth carried the medal outside and stood beneath the walnut. She did not know Thomas Merritt Bell. She did not know whether her own bells and Abigail's bells were joined in any line a courthouse record could trace, or whether the sign above the door had only called to her because she was desperate enough to hear it. But she held the medal in her palm until the cold passed through the bronze into her skin. Then she wrapped it again and returned it to the tin. That night she did not place the box back into the hidden compartment. She set it beside her on the floor near the inner wall, close enough that she could reach it in the dark. The journal lay on top, the folded letter tucked beneath its cover. Elias's brown bottle rested beside it. The heirloom tools, cleaned only of loose dust, were wrapped in Abigail's apron and placed along the wall as if sleeping there too. The fire burned low. The beeswax candle had been pinched out after supper. Its softened top curved around the blackened wick. Ruth lay under her coat with the satchel folded beneath her head and the kept things within arm's reach. The building moved around her in the night with its usual small sounds, but those sounds no longer seemed empty. A board settled, the chimney breathed, the creak worked at the stones beyond the wall. Ruth closed her eyes with ash, paper, iron, and handwriting beside her, and for the first time since the door had closed behind her weeks before, she slept as if the room knew her name. The first snow came on December 6th. laying 3 inches over the clearing by morning and showing Ruth every place the roof had failed. It entered not as a storm but as a patient examination. Fine powder sifted through the lifted seams and gathered on the floorboards in thin white lines, near the north wall where Mrs. Pruitt had warned her not to sleep. Snow lay in a narrow drift along the sill. In the back room, a small heap formed beside the kettle base, delicate as flour, and another settled on the shoulder of the leach trough. Ruth woke before dawn to the changed sound of the building, the roof no longer tapping or ticking but holding a dense, soft silence beneath the weight of winter. She made tea from hot water and nothing else, wrapped her hands around the tin cup, and opened the farm repair book to the roof chapter for the first time. The language was plain enough, but plain language did not make the work simple. Roof pitch, rafters, sheathing, felt courses, exposure, lap, flashing, drip edge. She read the chapter once and understood the order of tasks. She read it again and understood the places where a body could be careless. She read it a third time in the late afternoon, while snowmelt dropped into pans around her, and copied the necessary measurements into her notebook. The building was 32 feet by 24 on its soundest lines, with a steep roof that made each slope longer than a person expected from the ground. The south plane had lost fewer shingles. Though rusted tin had been nailed over the worst seam, the north plane was poorer. Cedar shakes beneath the sheet metal had gone soft near the ridge, and the lower edge showed rot where water had curled back under the eave. She could not replace the whole roof properly. Not yet. What she could do was make it shed water through the winter and keep the rafters from drinking more than they already had. Mr. Lawson came out 2 days later in a faded blue truck that sounded tired before it reached the drive. He stood in the clearing with his coat collar turned up and studied the roof without speaking. Ruth stood beside him with her notebook open, waiting for the verdict. His breath showed white. Snow slid from a laurel branch and fell with a muffled sound. Partial patch, he said at last. North plane first. Yes. Not pretty. No. Pretty is for June. Together they marked the list. 2 bundles of 3-tab shingles from last year's damaged stack, enough to cover the worst section if she staggered carefully, half roll of 15-pound felt, 1 coffee can of roofing nails, 1 1/4 inch, galvanized because the box had split in storage and he could not sell them as new, a narrow piece of drip edge for the worst eave, 1 tube of roof cement for the flashing at the chimney shoulder, 12 feet of scrap flashing bent from an older job, 2 sister rafter boards, 2 by 6, 8 feet long, rough but straight, a chalk line, a handful of screws, a loaned hammer because hers was still only a need. At the bottom of the truck bed, beneath the shingles, Mr. Lawson took out a tool wrapped in feed sack. It was a roofing hatchet, the head dark and worn, the gauge tooth dulled but present, the handle wrapped near the throat with old friction tape. He held it for a moment before giving it to her. "This was my brother Wayne's," he said. "He roofed every barn between here and Valley Bend until his knees quit him." Ruth accepted it carefully. "I will bring it back. You will use it right first." On the 3rd day of roof work, a second man arrived. He came walking up the drive with a ladder balanced on one shoulder and a coil of rope in his other hand. He was thin and bent, with a wool cap pulled low and a grey moustache that hid most of his mouth. Mr. Lawson had sent him, though not with advance notice, because some older men consider warning a form of ceremony best avoided. His name was Silas Rook, and he had roofed for 46 years before a fall from a church fellowship hall taught him what gravity had been saving up. "I do not take pay," he said before Ruth could offer any. "I take coffee if it is hot. I have water, then heat it." Silas taught in fragments, never speeches. He tied the ladder before stepping on it. He showed Ruth how to lift a shingle without tearing the course above it, how to feel with her boot for the rafter line, how to keep her weight low on the slope. He knocked 1 loose nail with the side of the hatchet and pointed. "That nail's proud." Ruth pulled it. Again. She pulled the next. Not crooked. She reset it. 3 strokes, he said. Set. Drive. Seat. He made her practice on scrap before she touched the roof. The first strike placed the nail. The second drove it nearly flush. The The third seated it without cutting the shingle face. When she struck too hard, he said, "You bruised it." When she struck too light, he said, "Rain will find that." When she tried to explain, he looked at the sky until she stopped explaining. They worked 11 days, not all full days, because winter light was brief and the roof kept its own limits. Some mornings the frost made the shingles slick until 10, and Silas would sit in the doorway with his hands around the tin cup, while Ruth sorted nails, cut felt, and read the next page of the book. Some afternoon's wind came down from the ridge and lifted the felt before they could fasten it, so they weighted the roll with stones and waited without argument. The sister rafter was the hardest lesson. In the back room, beneath the north slope, one rafter had split along a knot and sagged enough to pull the sheathing down with it. Silas showed her how to jack it only a little, using a post, a block, and patience, never forcing the timber back to a shape it had lost over decades. They fitted the new 2x6 beside the old, clamped it, drilled pilot holes, and fastened it with screws set in a staggered pattern. "Do not shame old wood," Silas said. Ruth looked at him. He tapped the sister board. "Help it. Do not pretend it is new." By December 17th, the North Plain no longer admitted snow. It still looked patched, and the South Plain still needed more than Ruth could give it, but the worst seam had been covered. The flashing near the chimney pressed tight into Ruth's cement, and the eave was carrying meltwater beyond the wall instead of back into it. That afternoon Silas climbed down last, rubbed his hands together, and studied the work from the clearing. "It will hold winter," he said. Ruth stood beside him, too tired to answer quickly. Silas took the empty cup from the doorstep. "Spring will ask again." "I know." He nodded once, as if knowing were a fair start, and carried his ladder down the drive. That night, the snow turned to rain. Ruth lay awake, listening. Water moved over the new patch, found the drip edge, and fell outside where it belonged. It was not silence. It was better than silence. It was proof. By January, the chimney no longer frightened Ruth in the same immediate way, which made it possible to see how badly it needed her. The first cleaning had opened its throat and allowed a careful fire, but fire revealed what cold had hidden. When the bricks warmed, fine cracks darkened along the lower courses, mortar powdered at the touch near the firebox arch. On the outer stack 2 bricks had begun to spall, their faces flaking away in thin red scales where moisture had entered and frozen. At the rear shoulder, the old lime mortar had receded so deeply that Ruth could lay a pencil in the joint and still see shadow behind it. She brought a broken piece to Lawson's in a paper sack. Lawson set it on the counter, touched it with the end of his pencil, and sighed through his nose. Soft brick. Old lime. Do not put hard Portland against that. I read that in the book. Good. Book saved you one mistake. He took her to the back storeroom, where cold came through the loading door and sacks leaned against the wall like tired men. There he found a torn bag of hydraulic lime, still dry in the centre, a small sack of fire clay, and clean mason's sand in a bin beneath a tarp. He wrote ratios on the back of a receipt. 2 parts sharp sand, 1 part hydraulic lime for exterior repointing. For firebox joints, 2 parts sand, 1 part fire clay, 1 part lime, mixed stiff, not soupy. Dampen old brick first. Rake joints to sound material. Pack deep, finish recessed, not smeared over the face. Warm water, he said. Not hot. Keep mix from freezing 2 days if you can. It is January, I noticed. She carried the supplies back in 2 trips, each one cutting her shoulder beneath the weight. The work began in temperatures that stayed mostly in the 20s, with mornings low enough that the creek edges hardened white and the metal latch stung her fingertips. Ruth built small fires only after the day's mortar work was done far enough from the heat. She hung a piece of canvas to keep the draft off the repair and stacked warmed stones near the base at night, not touching the mortar, only persuading the air around it to remain above freezing. Raking joints was slow, exact labour. She used a nail set, an old screwdriver, and a stiff brush, removing failed mortar until the material behind it held. The sound changed when she reached good work. Powder whispered. Sound mortar answered with a dry scrape. She learned to hear the difference. Every 15 minutes her bare fingers went numb despite the gloves, because gloves were too clumsy for the narrowest joints. She would stop, tuck both hands beneath her arms, and wait until pain returned. Pain meant circulation, pain meant continue. The firebox demanded crouching. The arch bricks had been laid by someone who understood heat, and Ruth found herself apologizing when her tool slipped and scratched one face. She dampened the joints with a brush, pressed the fireclay mix deep with a narrow stick, and struck the surface smooth with the back of a spoon from the front room drawer. Outside wind dragged through the laurel. Inside the room smelled of wet mineral, ash and lime. There were days she made almost no visible progress. One afternoon she spent 3 hours on a section no longer than her hand, removing bad material from behind a brick without loosening the brick itself. Another morning the mortar she had mixed began to stiffen too fast in the cold, and she had to discard it rather than pretend poor work would become sound because she needed it to. Waste hurt her. Dishonesty would have hurt the chimney. Mr. Lawson came once to inspect. He ran his finger along the new joint and nodded without praise. Do not polish it. I will not. Old chimneys like to show their seams. Yes. For 3 weeks Ruth worked in the low grinding pattern of winter repair. Mix, rake, dampen, pack. Strike cover, warm hands, record. She wrote down each batch in the notebook because Abigail's instructions had made recording feel less like study and more like companionship. January 12th. Exterior lower shoulder. 2 sand. 1 lime. 28 degrees. Set slow. January 16th. Firebox arch. 2 sand. 1 fireclay. 1 lime. Kept canvas overnight. No cracking. January 23rd. Stack north face. Spalled brick patched at edge, not replaced. Late in the month, after 2 days of dry cold, she tested the chimney again. She began with paper, then shavings, then small seasoned oak from a deadfall. Silas had told her she could cut if she kept to what had already come down. The flame rose, smoke gathered in the firebox, turned toward the throat, and pulled upward in a clean, steady body. Ruth crouched before it, watching for leaks along the repaired joints. None showed outside. She stepped into the yard and looked up. Smoke lifted from the chimney in a pale column, then thinned into the grey January sky. It did not pour from cracks. It did not roll under the eaves. It went where it was asked to go. Ruth stood in the clearing with her hands blackened, her face chapped, and her coat smelling of lime and soot. The cold remained, the debts remained. The building still needed more than she knew how to give, but the chimney had accepted fire without complaint, and there are forms of shelter that begin only when a dangerous thing is made honest again. After the chimney came the floors, because winter had forced Ruth's eyes downward. The roof kept water out where the patch had reached. The chimney drew, the walls still leaned, and the windows still trembled, but the floor was what carried her every hour, and she had come to know its injuries too closely to ignore them. In the front room, the white pine planks were wide, some nearly 14 inches, their surfaces cupped by age and darkened by soot, boot oil, spilled lye and weather carried in through the open years. Hand-cut rosehead nails held most of them irregular and beautiful, each head slightly different from the next. Near the doorway 2 boards were split beyond saving. Near the counter 1 had lifted enough to catch her toe. She did not want to sand away history. She wanted to remove splinters, grime, and the grey film that made the room feel permanently abandoned. Silas, when asked, told her the difference was in pressure. Let the machine work, he said. You are not angry at the floor. The random orbit sander came from Lawson's rental shelf for $14 a day, charged to the account with Mr. Lawson's eyebrows raised but his pen moving. Ruth rented it for 1 day and prepared for 2 days before using it. She set every loose nail. The rose heads she would not bury, but she made sure none stood proud enough to tear paper or skin. She swept, vacuumed with a borrowed shop vac that smelled of sawdust and mice, and covered the open doorway to the back room with canvas so dust would not settle into the tools. She began with 80 grit, moving with the boards, never staying too long in one place. The machine hummed through her wrists and shoulders until her teeth seemed to know the sound. Old finish rose in fine brown powder. Dirt that had looked permanent began to loosen. The first pass did not make the floor pretty. It made it readable. Grain appeared beneath the dark. The wide planks showed rings from trees that had grown slowly through summers of rain and summers of hunger, then been cut, planed, walked upon, neglected, and still remained underfoot. The 120 grit pass changed the room. Edges softened. Splintered places became safer to cross in socks. The boards near the counter revealed a pale gold undertone where Ruth had expected only grey. She worked from front wall to back, kneeling often with a hand block in the corners where the machine could not reach. Dust gathered in her hair, in the creases of her sleeves, in the hollow at the base of her throat. She wore the mask until the elastic cut behind her ears. The 220 grit pass was not strictly necessary according to the book, but Ruth did it because her grandfather had taught her that hands know what eyes forgive. After the last pass, she wiped the boards with a damp cloth and watched the colour deepen briefly under water. Dark honey near the window, warm amber by the hearth, almost mahogany where years of work had pressed human oil and ash into the path between counter and kettle room. For finish, Mr. Lawson sold her a dented tin of tung oil and half a bottle of boiled linseed oil someone had returned because the cap stuck. He instructed her with unusual severity. Thin coats, no puddles, rags laid flat outside to dry, never wadded, never left near heat, unless she wanted a fire she had not invited. She mixed the first coat sparingly, worked it in with cloth, and watched the wood drink. The first coat disappeared by morning. The second coat stayed longer, leaving a low sheen in the grain. She waited 48 hours, though impatience walked the room with her. The third coat went on thinner than the first two, less an application than a conversation with the wood. When it cured, the floor did not shine like new varnish. It held light quietly. Boards once grey with abandonment now carried colours that shifted by hour. Honey at noon, chestnut toward dusk, dark red-brown near the stove when the fire was lit. Then came the bad morning. It arrived without drama 2 days after the final coat had cured, when the room should have rewarded her with satisfaction. Ruth woke heavy, every limb reluctant, the air too cold, the work list too long, the account at Lawson's too real. A pan had begun catching water beneath a south seam she had not reached. The cracked windows breathed frost. The journal waited with its many pages unread. The money sat sealed again, less a solution than a responsibility with numbers. She looked at the broom, the stacked tools, the mortar bucket needing cleaning, and could not make her hand lift. So she did not work. At first this felt like failure. Then it became a decision. She put on her coat, took nothing but the tin cup, and walked beyond the creek to a low marshy place where cattails stood broken and brown above skim ice. The sky was the colour of pewter. Water moved under the ice with occasional dark openings where current kept it alive. Ruth sat on a fallen log, wrapped her hands around the empty cup, and watched a great blue heron standing in the shallows. The bird did nothing for a long time. It stood with one leg hidden, neck drawn in, body the colour of weathered slate. Its eye was fixed on water Ruth could not see into. It did not hurry because hunger was present. It did not abandon its place because cold had entered the reeds. Once, very slowly, it extended its neck and placed its foot in another patch of water. That was all. Ruth stayed until her toes hurt and the cup had gone colder than her hands. No revelation came. No plan arranged itself. But the day passed without her damaging anything by forcing tired hands onto honest work. Near dusk, the heron lifted with 3 deliberate wing beats and crossed the marsh toward the creek. The next morning, Ruth swept the finished floor with care and went back to work. February entered through the windows. There were 8 in all if the back room's narrow fixed sash was counted, and each had failed in its own manner. 3 held no glass, only jagged triangles along the putty line and cardboard. Someone had nailed from the inside years before. 4 were cracked, their panes held together by dirt, old tape, and the mercy of still air. One window high on the east wall of the workroom held its original wavy glass, uneven and faintly green at the thicker edge. A date had been scratched into the lower rail, 7088. Ruth did not know whether the sash itself had truly belonged to that year, or had been carried from an older building when the works was repaired. It did not matter. She would not replace it. She began by removing what had already failed. Old glazing came away in flakes after being warmed in her hands and coaxed with a putty knife Mr. Lawson had sharpened on the store's back step. Points rusted into crumbs. The empty sashes were more fragile than they looked, and twice she had to stop, breathe, and remember Silas's words about helping old wood rather than shaming it. She brushed the rabbits clean, sealed bare places with a little thinned oil, and let them rest near the stove before setting new glass. Mr. Lawson cut the panes from salvage glass stacked behind the store, charging less for bubbles, scratches, and uneven corners. Matches the house better, he said, wrapping each piece in newspaper. He sold her DAP 33 glazing putty from a tub, and showed her how to knead a ball of it in her palm until it softened. Bed the glass first. Press points flat, roll the putty into a rope, lay it along the edge. Draw the knife in one deliberate pass, corner to corner, clean angle, no fussing it to death. Her first line was poor. Lumpy, hesitant, too thick at the corner. She scraped it off and began again. By the third pane, the motion had entered her wrist. The putty knife rode along the sash with steady pressure, leaving a beveled line that would shed water away from the glass. She learned to clean the knife after each pass, to cut corners with the blade angled outward, to leave the putty alone once it had accepted its shape. Outside, the wind pressed against the new panes and found less invitation than before. The sash cords were another kind of lesson. 4 of the windows had counterweights hidden inside pockets, though the cords had rotted away. Ruth pried open the narrow access panels and found the iron weights resting at the bottom like dropped intentions. Mr. Lawson measured the old channel and gave her 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, plain and strong. Tie the figure-8 knot at the counterweight, he told her. Feed it over the pulley. Do not use clothesline. Clothesline stretches and lies. She tied the first knot 3 times before trusting it. The figure-8 held compact and exact, tightening under pull without jamming against the pocket. She fed the cord over the pulley with wire, heard the counterweight rise inside the wall, and attached the other end to the sash. When she lifted the window, it moved upward and stayed. Ruth laughed once, softly, not because the repair was grand, but because something that had been dead in the wall had remembered its purpose. The original east window took a whole day, though it needed no new glass. She cleaned it with warm water, vinegar, and a cloth, never scraping hard near the scratch date. The old pane bent the view beyond it, making the walnut branches ripple slightly when she moved her head. Through it the world appeared not false, but tenderly altered, as if the glass had kept some memory of being liquid. By the last week of February, 7 windows were repaired, reglazed or temporarily sealed well enough to keep weather out. The 8th was the front room window nearest the walnut trees. Its lower pane had been cracked in a long diagonal, and the sash cord on one side had failed. Ruth removed the broken glass, cleaned the channel, set a salvaged pane, pressed the points, and rolled the putty between her palms until it warmed. As she drew the final bevel, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside. It was close enough that she could see the tiny black cap, the white cheek. The bird's feet closed around the twig. It turned its head once and looked through the new glass at her work. Ruth held the putty knife still. The bird remained for several breaths, round against the cold, then flicked away into the laurel with a movement too quick for the eye to keep. Ruth finished the corner, cleaned the blade, and lowered the sash. The window held. Late February taught Ruth that walls remember touch differently than floors. The plaster near the chimney had failed in 3 patches, each one shaped by a different injury. The first had loosened where heat and damp had worked together behind the stove wall, leaving a bulge that sounded hollow when tapped with 2 knuckles. The second had cracked above the firebox arch, a narrow branching line like a winter creek seen from above. The third had fallen away entirely, exposing hand-split oak lath beneath, grey with age but still holding in most places. Horsehair curled from the broken edges in fine dark threads, caught in the lime like memory caught in bone. Ruth had seen modern drywall in rentals, smooth and empty and quick to break. This was different. The plaster had been built in coats by people who expected a wall to last beyond them. The oak lath had been split, not sawn, leaving rough faces that gave the plaster something to grip. Each strip was nailed with small irregular nails, spaced by eye, leaving narrow keys where the first coat had squeezed through and hardened behind the wood. Even the failed patches had dignity. Mr. Lawson kept the horsehair in a paper bag from the 1950s, high on a shelf behind canning lids and stove bolts. Bought for a church repair, he said, climbing down with dust on his sleeve. Church hired a man from Charleston instead. Man used wallboard. He set the bag on the counter and opened it. The hair inside was clean, dark, and coarse, tied in loose bundles. Ruth touched it with 2 fingers. How much? For 3 patches? He weighed the bag in his palm. Take what you need. I should pay. You will. Some day I will need candles, soap, or some other old trouble you have learnt to make. He taught her the plaster mix as carefully as he would have taught a recipe that could not be rescued once spoiled. Lime putty, clean sand, chopped horsehair for the scratch coat, less hair for the brown. None in the finish unless the wall asked for it. Wet the old edges, brush dust from the lath. Never plaster over loose hope. Press the first coat through until it mushrooms behind the strips, then score it while green so the next layer can grip. Let the wall rest. A wall that has waited this long will not thank you for haste. The scratch coat was rough work. Ruth mixed until her shoulders burned, folding the hair into the lime and sand so it spread evenly and did not clump in the trowel. She pressed the plaster into the exposed lath with firm upward strokes, forcing it through the gaps until she could feel resistance from the keys forming behind. Then she raked shallow horizontal lines across the surface with a notched scrap of wood and stood back. It looked poor, deliberately poor, like a field left furrowed before planting. The brown coat came 3 days later after 72 hours of guarded warmth and damp cloth over the patch edges. She mixed it stiffer, with less hair, and built the surface out to 3/8 of an inch, feathering it toward the older plaster without smearing over soundwork. The brown coat required patience of the eye too proud, and the finish would bulge too shallow, and the old wound would show in shadow forever. Ruth learned to use the straight edge Mr. Lawson had lent her, drawing it across the patch until high spots revealed themselves. The finish coat was only 1/8 of an inch, pale and fine, smoothed with the trowel until it held light without shining. She did not make it perfect. Perfect would have been dishonest beside walls that had survived smoke, abandonment, frost, and the passage of hands long gone. She let the repair show faintly at the edge, like a scar kept clean. When the last patch had tightened, Ruth stood with her palm near the wall, not touching, feeling the cool dampness release into the room. The chimney breathed. The plaster held. These patches will hold another 100 years. She said it only inwardly, not as a boast, but as an agreement with the hand-split lath, the lime, the horsehair, and the people who had first raised the wall. Outside, late snow slid from the laurel in small collapses. Inside, the building seemed less interrupted, not finished, never finished, but less broken in the places where heat would pass. The house was not empty. It had been waiting. Doris Vance owned the Mill Creek Cafe and moved through it as if the floorboards had been trained by her shoes. She was a square-built woman with iron-grey hair cut at her chin, arms strong from carrying plates and eyes that missed very little while appearing to mind the coffee. Her cafe had 6 tables, 8 counter-stools, a pie case, 2 framed photographs of floodwater on Main Street, and a chalkboard menu that changed according to weather, deliveries, and Doris's private judgment of what people deserved to eat. Meatloaf on Thursdays was dependable. Chicken and dumplings appeared when grief had passed through town. Pie was never promised, which made it feel more truthful when present. Ruth first noticed the paper bags on the doorstep after the roof work. One sat against the front door, folded twice at the top, weighted with a can of tomatoes. Inside were biscuits, soup in a jar, 2 apples gone soft but usable, and a heel of cheddar wrapped in waxed paper. No note. 3 days later, another bag appeared, this one with cornbread, beans, and a small square of molasses cake. Ruth carried the second bag back to town and set it on the cafe counter. "I cannot take this without paying," she said. Doris poured coffee for a man at the far stool and did not look up. "Then do not." "It was at my door. Lots of doors in this county. It had your wax paper." Doris glanced at the wrapping, then at Ruth. Could be anybody's wax paper. The man at the stool hid a smile behind his cup. "I mean to pay," Ruth said. Doris wiped the counter with a cloth already clean. "In candles when the shop reopens." "I do not have a shop. Not today." That was all she would say. After that, paper bags came irregularly. Never often enough to feel like charity arranged on a schedule, never so rarely that Ruth could dismiss them as accident. Doris included practical things: soup bones, bruised fruit, stale bread, bacon ends, a jar of pickles with a cracked lid, once a folded pair of wool socks with no explanation. Ruth wrote each item down in the back of her notebook under debts not measured in money. Caleb Pritchard arrived on a Schwinn bicycle too large for him and too fine for the muddy road he rode it on. He was 15, narrow-shouldered, with hair falling into his eyes and a manner that seemed divided between shyness and stubbornness. The bicycle had been red once, though weather and hard use had dulled it. A milk crate was wired over the back wheel, and inside it he carried a splitting maul, 2 wedges and a paper sack of biscuits wrapped in a dish towel. Ruth heard the tires in the gravel and came to the door with a trowel still in her hand. "My mother said you need wood split," Caleb said. "I do. I can split. I do not have money for help." He looked past her toward the wood pile, then down at his boots. "My mother said." "About the money?" "About your grandfather." The words stood between them in the cold. Ruth lowered the trowel. Did she know him? She said he fixed her grandmother's kettle and would not take cash because there was a baby sick in the house. Caleb lifted the maul from the crate. "She said I was to split wood and not argue." He worked without flourish. At first Ruth stayed nearby expecting to teach or correct, but Caleb knew enough to set round steady, strike with his hips, and keep his feet wide of the blade. He split oak into stove lengths, then kindling, stacking each size separately, because Ruth asked once and he remembered. When she brought him water, he drank half and poured the rest over the maul head to clean mud from it. When she offered a biscuit from Doris's bag, he refused until she took one too. He came twice a week through March, always after school, always leaving before dark. Ruth learned that his father worked pipeline jobs in other states, that his mother cleaned the clinic, that Caleb liked engines but did not like loud rooms. He spoke in sentences shorter than Silas's, but the woodpile grew under his hands, and the building warmed more steadily because of him. One evening, as he tied the maul to the bicycle with cord, he looked up at the sign over the door. "Bell and Merritt," he said. "Needs paint." "It needs many things." He nodded. Still readable. Reverend Boyd was not the minister of any church Ruth had attended, yet he became part of the works by walking past it every morning. He was a tall black man in his 70s, retired from a small Methodist congregation 2 hollows over, with a felt hat brushed clean and a walking stick made from mountain laurel. His house sat beyond the creek road, and his doctor had told him walking was better than pills for the stiffness in his joints. He passed the drive at 7:15 most mornings, close enough to be heard before he was seen, his stick tapping lightly against stones. At first he only lifted his hat when Ruth was outside. "Morning, Miss Bell." "Morning, Reverend." By the 2nd week, she paused at the drive. "Roof holding." "So far, good." By the 3rd, she came far enough into the clearing to stand beneath the walnut and look at the chimney smoke. He did not ask to come in. He did not inspect the work. He looked at the building the way some people look at graves and gardens, knowing both require humility. "My grandmother used lye soap that would take the hide off a careless boy," he said one morning. Ruth smiled faintly. "Strong batch." She said clean was not the same as gentle. He tipped his hat. She was right too often. His prayers were never announcements. He did not place a hand on her shoulder or ask what she believed. He simply passed the drive, lifted 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, and said 4 words in a voice low enough for the road to keep. "Lord, keep this house." Then he walked on. Ruth began to listen for the tap of his stick as she mixed mortar, cut glass or swept ash from the hearth. Sometimes she did not see him, only heard the prayer passing through bare branches and morning. It became one more measured thing in the day, like creek water like stove draft, like the slow tightening of putty in the sash. None of them spoke of rescue. Not Doris with her paper bags, not Caleb with his maul, not Reverend Boyd with his hat and four-word prayer. They brought no speeches about strength. They asked for no confession of suffering. They entered the story by usefulness, and because of that, Ruth could receive them without having to perform gratitude until it became another kind of debt. The works had once served neighbours in measures of ash, alkali, soap, and careful record. Now the current moved the other direction. Soup came up the road, split wood stacked by the wall, prayer crossed the morning. The invisible threads Abigail had named were not invisible because they were unreal. They were invisible because people had stopped being trained to see them. Ruth postponed the cellar until February 11th, because some darkness should not be entered merely because it is available. The cellar door lay beneath a slanted hatch in the back room floor, between the leach trough and the north wall. She had noticed its iron pull the first week, cleared around it the second, and avoided opening it through December and January with the reasonable excuse that roof, chimney, windows, and fire mattered more. All of that was true. It was also true that underground spaces carry their own authority, and Ruth had been living too near uncertainty to invite another chamber of it before the house above had begun to hold. On February 11th, after a dry cold morning and no smell of damp rot from below, she opened the hatch. The hinges resisted, then gave with a long complaining creak. Cold air rose at once, not foul but deep, smelling of stone, earth, old apples, and mineral water. Ruth tied the hatch open with rope, lit a candle, and waited to see if the flame weakened it held. She lowered the flashlight next, then one foot, then the other. 7 granite steps led down, each worn in the middle by feet long absent. She kept one hand on the fieldstone wall and descended slowly. The cellar measured 12 by 15 feet, larger than expected, with a fieldstone floor laid in uneven but deliberate courses. Water had entered at some time along the north wall, leaving a mineral stain, but the floor was mostly dry. Shelves lined one side, collapsed in the middle. Broken crocks rested beneath them. In one corner stood an empty barrel with its hoops rusted through. Roots fine as hair had entered through a high crack and dried there, reaching into air without finding soil. At the centre of the room lay a single-dressed granite slab. It did not match the floor. The other stones were irregular, gathered and fitted by use. This one was rectangular, smooth on top, and set with its long side aligned east to west. In its centre had been carved the same mark Ruth had found on the flat stone beneath the walnut, a circle with a small flame shape rising from the bottom edge. The carving was shallow but exact, its edges softened by age and dust. Ruth stood over it with the flashlight in one hand and the candle in the other. A person in another kind of story might have lifted it at once. Ruth did not. The slab was heavy, perhaps too heavy for her, and it had been placed with intention. The mark did not ask for speed, it asked to be noticed, recorded, respected. She knelt, brushed dust from the carving, measured the slab with her fingers and then with a length of cord, and wrote the dimensions in her notebook after climbing back upstairs for the pencil. Centre slab, dressed granite, craft mark, do not lift alone, do not lift yet. The decision steadied her. She searched the rest of the cellar by walls. Not mystery. Shelf remains 3 boards rotten, 1 iron bracket. South corner, crock shards, blue stripe. No maker visible. East wall, small vent to outside, clogged with leaves. Barrel empty. Dray, no odour. Floor sound except northwest damp. Stairs, granite. 3rd step loose at back. It was on the stairs going up that her boot struck a dull wooden sound. The 3rd step had seemed set like the others, but when she pressed the rear edge with her toe it shifted less than an inch. Ruth set down the candle, knelt on the step above, and ran her fingers along the underside. Something had been wedged there between stone and sidewall, hidden not by elaborate mechanism but by the assumption that people look down when descending and ahead when leaving. She worked it free with both hands. It was a small oak box, no longer than her forearm, darkened by dust and sealed with a simple brass hook. She carried it upstairs before opening it. Some things, she had learned, deserved daylight. At the table, with the fire low and the front room newly lit by repaired glass, Ruth brushed the lid clean. The brass hook lifted easily. Inside lay 2 objects wrapped in soft cloth. The first was a key brass heavy for its size, with a narrow shaft and a bow shaped like the craft mark, a small circle enclosing a rising flame. Its teeth were not simple. They stepped twice, then cut inward, made for a lock older or more particular than anything Ruth had yet found. The second object was a tintype photograph. The image had darkened at the edges, but the centre remained clear enough to stop her hand. A young woman stood in front of the works in summer light, one hand resting on a long wooden paddle, the other holding her skirt away from the dust. She wore a plain dress, sleeves rolled to the forearm, hair pinned back but not tidily, as if work had already had its say that morning. The sign above the door was newer in the photograph, the letters dark and sharp. Behind her, the walnut trees were slimmer, their branches not yet touching over the road. The woman's face resembled Ruth's closely enough that Ruth sat down. Not exactly. The chin was stronger, the mouth wider, the brows heavier, but the eyes carried the same inward. Measuring stillness Ruth had seen in no mirror kindly. She held the tintype nearer the window, then farther away. The woman looked back across the surface of more than a century without smiling, not sternly, simply without asking to be made pleasant for the camera. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Naomi Bell Merritt, daughter of Josiah Merritt, age 25, summer of 1903. The date did not fit the Abigail letter's lineage in a neat way, Ruth understood at once. Naomi, daughter of Josiah, should have been older by then if she was the same Naomi named in the letter. Perhaps this was another Naomi named for the first. Perhaps the back had been written later by someone who knew the names but not the years. Families reused names the way fields reused paths. Ruth did not force the record into certainty. She wrote exactly what she saw. She placed the photograph beside the journal, the brass key beside the candle, and the oak box near the wall. The key did not fit the tin box. It did not fit the front door. It did not fit the cabinet under the counter, the cellar hatch, the old desk drawer, or the rusted lock still hanging useless on a shed hook outside. After trying those, Ruth stopped. A key with that much care in its making was not meant to explain itself to impatience. She set it on the mantel. From there it caught firelight in the evenings, a small brass question shaped like a flame held inside a circle. Caleb noticed it once and asked what it opened. "I do not know yet," Ruth said. He accepted this as a complete answer. So did she. By March, the snow retreated from the edges first. It remained longest under the laurel and along the north wall, grey and granular, withdrawing day by day until the first green spears showed through leaf mould near the creek. Water took possession of the hollow. The creek that had spoken all winter now lifted its voice with snowmelt, running loud over stones brown and quick, shouldering branches downstream and filling the air behind the works with motion. The marsh where Ruth had watched the heron thawed into shining pockets. Skunk cabbage rose in dark red hoods from the wet ground. The walnut trees began to loosen their catkins, long and pale green, and every wind carried the faint bitter scent of their waking. The house changed with the season. Light entered earlier through the repaired windows and stayed longer on the finished floor. The plaster patches dried to a gentler colour, putty-skinned over in the sash. The chimney, no longer tested by constant frost, drew with less effort. Ruth opened the door some afternoons and let the front room air itself while she swept, mended, read, or sat with the journal across her lap. Abigail's instructions tempted her. The jars were still sealed. The heirloom tools were ready enough for small work. The creek could give water. Fallen hardwood could be burned clean. Ruth had learned the theory, copied ratios, studied ledger entries until the pattern of the old craft began to settle into her hands before she practiced it. Yet when she stood in the back room before the kettle base, she understood that beginning in spring would mean beginning too soon. The roof still needed its south slope made sound. The well remained unopened. The cellar slab remained unlifted. The account at Lawson's had grown long enough to deserve respect. Skill, if treated as a door one could fling open, became performance. Elias had taught her better. Abigail had written it plainer still. Begin smaller than pride allows. So Ruth decided not to begin the craft that spring. Instead, she would order materials with one coin, only one, chosen not for rarity but for usefulness. She selected a worn silver dollar from the cache, recorded its date, wrapped it in paper, and took it to a dealer in Elkins whose name Mr. Lawson trusted. The money it brought was not large by the standards of people who speak easily about value, but it was enough to buy lie-safe gloves, pH strips, a used thermometer rated high enough for boiling, 2 glass jars, a steel funnel, and a small quantity of clean hardwood ash from a man who burned only oak for a smokehouse. She would practice on samples no larger than a teacup. She would ruin little, she would record everything. Doris put a blank index card on the cafe corkboard for her and said nothing about it. Ruth did not fill it yet. Caleb split the last of the winter deadfall and leaned them all by the shed. Reverend Boyd's morning prayer began to include the word shop, though he still said it under his breath. Mrs. Pruitt sent a copy of an old survey she had found in a drawer, folded in county paper, with the Kettle house marked in ink. Mr. Lawson asked no questions when Ruth bought the thermometer, but he wrote the sale in the ledger with unusual neatness. On an April evening, Ruth stood beneath the walnut tree and looked at the works through the new green haze of spring. The signs still needed paint. The roof still bore patches. The walls still leaned where time had leaned on them first. But smoke rose clean from the chimney. Windows held the sunset, and inside on the table lay a notebook with her own entries beginning to follow the old ones. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Ruth completed her first true batch. Not a demonstration, not a trial in a cup. Not the cautious samples she had made through 2 springs and summers, each one recorded, corrected, and sometimes thrown out before pride could defend it. This was a full, usable batch drawn from clean hardwood ash. She had burned herself in a slow fire after sorting the wood by species, weather, age and purpose. Oak for steadiness, hickory for strength, a little maple because Abigail had called it gentle, and Ruth had come to respect gentleness as a practical quality, not a decoration. She had rebuilt the leach tub the previous autumn with Caleb's help, using chestnut boards salvaged from a collapsed smokehouse and hoops bent by a blacksmith in Beverly who still knew how to listen to old patterns. The false bottom was fitted with straw, gravel, and cloth. Soft water warmed in a kettle, ash tamped by hand, not rammed. The draw came slow, amber at first, then clearer, slick between gloved fingers and treated with caution. She boiled it over a steady fire, never letting flame climb one side higher than the other. Every 7 minutes she stirred, then every 3. The finished product was modest. A small quantity of refined potash, pale and dry, kept in a glass jar with a handwritten label. It would not have impressed a factory, it would not have changed any market. But Ruth held the jar in both hands as the evening lowered outside and knew that something had crossed back over from record into practice. The interior of the works had not been made new, which was why it had become beautiful. The front room held a counter scrubbed clean but still scarred, shelves repaired with mismatched boards, the farm book beside Abigail's journal, and a small iron stove set on a brick pad near the chimney wall. The finished pine floor had darkened with use into a warm, uneven glow. Windows held their wavy salvaged panes. The original east glass still bent the walnut branches into a softer world. Above the table, Ruth had hung Elias's brown bottle in a shallow shadow box with the label facing outward. Apple ash, October. Slow fire. The back room remained a working room. The kettle base had been repaired, and a second-hand iron kettle, smaller than the original must have been, rested over the firebox on a ring fitted by the blacksmith. Tools hung on the peg rail in order of use, not display. The brass skimmer, the ash rake, the marked paddles, new gloves, old apron, notebook, thermometer, a shelf of sealed jars, each labelled with wood, date, weather, and result. The room smelled of ash, lime, beeswax, clean smoke, and something faintly sweet from soap curing on a rack by the wall. The brass key waited on the mantel for nearly a year before Ruth found its lock. It happened during the 2nd December, after the first true batch had been sealed and labelled, on an afternoon when the sky hung low and the creek ran dark beneath ice along its edges. Caleb, taller now and driving his mother's truck with permission more often than not, had come to help clear a branch that had fallen from the old walnut near the creek bend. The branch had split in a windstorm, not badly enough to kill the tree, but enough to expose a hollow where the south fork had grown around the horseshoe. They worked carefully, cutting only what had already broken. Ruth stood on the ground steadying the rope while Caleb took small limbs first. When the fallen section was cleared, she noticed a shape in the trunk above the horseshoe almost hidden by bark that had folded over itself in long ridges. It looked at first like old damage, then like the edge of metal. She climbed the short ladder and brushed away moss with her thumb. A brass plate sat inside the living wood. The tree had grown around it so completely that only the center remained visible, greened by weather, marked with the same circle and flame as the key bow. Beneath the mark was a keyhole no wider than a thumbnail. Caleb stood below, one hand on the ladder. "That is yours." "I do not know that." He looked at her, then at the tree. "You have the key." The brass key had hung on the mantel so long Ruth had nearly stopped thinking of it as an unanswered thing. She brought it out wrapped in cloth, climbed again, and fitted it to the plate. For a moment it resisted, stiff with years of weather and sap. Then it turned. Inside the hollow was a tin cylinder sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth. The tree had held it above rot behind iron beneath living bark. Ruth carried it indoors before opening it, as she had carried the oak box, because daylight and a table seemed to be required by every honest discovery in that place. The oilcloth unwrapped cleanly. The wax seal bore the craft mark. Inside the cylinder lay a folded 48-star American flag, small enough to have been carried or kept in a drawer, its fabric worn at the creases but dry. Beneath it was a note written on thin paper dated November 11th, 1919. "My dear Abigail, Thomas asked me if he did not mend to see that this flag came back to the walnut, where he said all vows in this family seemed to know their way. I have kept it from the damp as best I could. He carried it folded in his kit after the armistice, and would not let the hospital orderly discard it when blood touched one corner. He said flags are not made holy by governments, but by the names of those who do not come home hold. If Daniel ever asks, tell him his father wanted no statue and no speech. He wanted the works kept dry, the accounts kept true, and the boy taught that bitterness is not the same as remembrance. I send also my sorrow for Samuel, whose body rests in France under a cross I have not seen but pray over from here. Your loving sister by marriage and by labour. Margaret Bell, Veterans Day, 1919. Ruth laid the flag on the table and stood over it for a long while. One corner did bear a stain, faded brown and small, no larger than a leaf pressed between pages. She did not touch it. The note had brought Thomas closer than the medal had, not as a name scratched into bronze, but as a man who had asked that a flag return to a tree because vows belonged there. Abigail had hidden the money. Margaret had hidden the flag. The tree had kept both silence and witness without needing to decide which mattered more. The following November, Ruth carried Thomas Merritt Bell's medal to Beverly Cemetery on Veterans Day. Mr. Lawson drove because the morning was wet and because he said old trucks needed purpose. Mrs. Pruitt had found the burial record in a county file and copied it for Ruth. Thomas had been buried in the veterans section beneath a modest stone, his service noted in letters nearly filled with lichen. Ruth brought no ceremony large enough to attract notice. She cleaned the stone with water, a soft brush, and thyme. She placed the medal in her palm, read his name from Abigail's letter, and then wrapped the medal again because Abigail had asked that it not be sold, not that it be left to weather. A small American flag already stood near the stone, placed by someone from the local post. Ruth straightened it when the wind bent the staff. On the drive back, "Mr. Lawson said, he has company now." Ruth looked out at wet fields passing. He had it before. The money remained mostly where Abigail had placed it. Ruth spent only 3 coins in those 2 years, and 1 paper note so damaged by age that the dealer advised preservation rather than circulation. The first coin bought the safety tools for learning. The second helped pay for the blacksmith's kettle ring. The third bought beeswax from a woman in Buchanan whose hives wintered better than most. Everything else was counted, recorded, wrapped again, and sealed in the tin with a new page added to the journal. Ruth did not pretend she had no need. Need had not vanished because a hidden box had opened. But the money had come with a grammar, and she had learned to read it. Spend slowly. Keep most of it together. She paid Lawson's account through work, small sales, repairs done for neighbours, and once a batch of strong soap Doris claimed for the cafe kitchen before Ruth had finished wrapping it. Mr. Lawson accepted payment without congratulation. He tore each paid slip from the ledger, folded it, and gave it to Ruth. She kept them in the journal because a debt honoured is also part of a house's history. The first sign that the shop had reopened was not a sign at all. It was an index card on the Mill Creek Cafe corkboard, pinned between a notice for laying hens and a church supper. Bell and Merritt Potash Works. Traditional ash soap. Candles. Small batch alkali by inquiry. No large orders. Leave name with Doris. Doris had written the last line herself. The card brought no crowd. It brought Mrs. Hanley's granddaughter, who wanted lye soap because her hands disliked perfume. It brought a fibre artist from Elkins who dyed wool with walnut and onion skins and wanted to test an older mordant. It brought a retired glassblower who did not need much but understood why Ruth asked what furnace he used. It brought neighbours who came less to buy than to see whether the old place had become safe to remember. By the end of the first year, the mailing list held 43 names written by hand in a ledger. Doris kept behind the pie case until Ruth made her own. Some lived nearby, some had moved away and heard through cousins. One woman in Ohio wrote that her great-aunt had spoken of Bell soap all her life and enclosed a photograph of a washstand. Ruth answered every letter, slowly, carefully, sometimes only with 2 sentences and a price, sometimes with a page about wood ash cure time and the difficulty of keeping a batch honest in damp weather. She did not become famous. No newspaper came unless one counted the church bulletin, where Reverend Boyd mentioned local restoration in one restrained paragraph without naming her until Ruth gave permission. No investor found the road. No festival banner appeared. The works reopened the way many worthy things return, by kitchen tables, word of mouth, honest use, and a few names written on paper. Caleb returned in April with a sign wrapped in an old quilt. He was 17 then, taller than Ruth by several inches, his shoulders beginning to broaden from wood, tools, and the particular hunger of a young man trying to decide what kind of strength will belong to him. He had been taking shop classes at the vocational centre and spending Saturdays with a woodcarver near Huttonsville who once made church pew ends and now mostly carved spoons because they fit his hands better. Caleb carried the wrapped sign across the clearing without meeting Ruth's eyes. "My mother said I should bring it before I lose nerve," he said. Ruth set down the jar she was labelling. "Then bring it." He laid it on the table and pulled back the quilt. The sign was carved from walnut. Not new wood, but a salvaged plank with grain dark as creek water. He had copied the old lettering from above the door, keeping the plain block shapes, the shallow cuts, the workmanlike spacing. But beneath Bell and Merritt Potash Works, she had added a smaller line. And daughters, plural. Ruth looked at it long enough that Caleb shifted his weight. "I can sand it off," he said. "No, it might be too much." "No." He watched her face. "It is not just about blood, is it?" Ruth ran one finger along the carved ampersand. The cut was clean, not ornamental. A joining mark. A kept promise in a curve. "No," she said. "It is not." They hung the sign beneath the old one rather than replacing it. The weathered board remained above the door, lichen in its carved letters, one end still lower than the other despite Ruth's repairs. Caleb's sign hung below, oiled and dark, catching afternoon light. The two together told the truth better than either alone. What had been added, what had been kept open. Doris came by after closing to see it, and pretended she had something in her eye because smoke from the chimney was drifting oddly. Mrs. Pruitt stood with her hands folded over her purse and said the county had certainly transferred stranger liabilities in its time. Reverend Boyd tipped his hat and gave the sign his 4 words. "Lord, keep this house." Mr. Lawson studied the hanging brackets. Level enough. Silas, who had come with a cane and no ladder, looked at Caleb and said, "That nail's proud." Caleb pulled it, reset it, and grinned only after turning away. That night, after everyone had gone and the clearing settled back into its own sounds, Ruth lit the beeswax candle stub from Abigail's bundle. Very little of it remained. She placed it on the table beside the journal, the paid slips, the copy of the deed, Margaret's note, the tintype photograph, Elias's ash bottle, and her own ledger. The room was warm enough that no frost gathered at the window. Outside spring rain began lightly on the roof and ran where it should. Ruth took out a sheet of paper. She had delayed this longer than necessary, because beginning felt presumptuous. Abigail's letter had been written at the edge of death, with diagnosis, lineage, war, craft, instruction, and welcome held in one steady hand. Ruth was not dying. She was 24, with lime scars on her knuckles, debts mostly paid, and a house that still asked for work every morning. But inheritance did not begin only at endings. Sometimes it began when a person understood she had received more than she could use alone. She sharpened the pencil with Elias's pocket knife and wrote the date. Then she wrote the first line. "My dear one, whoever you are." She stopped there for a while, listening. The house was not empty. It had been waiting. She wrote next about what she knew and what she did not. She wrote that the south roof had been rebuilt in September with help from a boy who arrived on a red bicycle and later made a sign. She wrote that the original east glass should not be replaced unless broken beyond repair. She wrote where the key had been found and what it opened. She wrote that the cellar slab remained unlifted because some answers deserve stronger backs, more witnesses, and a better season. She wrote that Doris at the cafe should be trusted, that Lawson's ledger was fair, that Reverend Boyd's prayer had entered the house before many repairs did. She wrote the truth about the money, how much remained, which coins had been spent, why she had kept Abigail's odd cents together. She wrote that poverty can make a person either careless or exact, and that exactness had saved her from scattering what was not hers alone. She wrote that no one should sell the medal. She wrote that if the next inheritor came cold, hungry, ashamed, or tired past language, they should eat first, sleep if they could, and delay decisions until morning. Near the end, she wrote Elias's sentence, "Nothing honest is made in a hurry." Then she added, in her own hand, that honesty was not only a virtue in people, it belonged to roofs, mortar, accounts, soap, ash, grief, and welcome. It belonged to anything asked to hold. She did not finish the letter that night. She folded the page once and placed it inside the journal. Not hidden, not complete, simply begun. The Potash Works waits. It has always waited. In the deputy clerk's office, in the narrow drawer beneath the deed ledger, Ruth's folded dollar remained where Mrs. Pruitt had placed it. The bill had softened further with time, though no one handled it much. Mrs. Pruitt had written a note around it on county stationery and clipped it to the receipt copy. Statutory consideration, Bell transfer, do not deposit. A younger clerk once asked why the office kept a single dollar in a drawer when accounting rules preferred cleaner habits. Mrs. Pruitt looked over her glasses, touched the brass stamp at the corner of her desk, and said some payments were records before they were money. So the dollar stayed. Not framed, not spoken of often, just kept in the dark drawer among papers, stamps, ink pads, and the quiet machinery by which places change hands. It waited there the way seeds wait, the way ash waits, the way a house can wait through decades of weather, until a young woman, with tired shoes, a guarded heart, and a name printed plainly on a deed steps through the door and begins, one careful repair at a time, to make room for the living and the dead.